two loving parents found dead in their home, each killed by a single gunshot.
I would never have thought such unimaginable terror could happen to such a lovely family.
Was it a murder followed by suicide, or a calculated execution?
The person we were looking for was clearly very forensically aware. It made our investigation very difficult.
What we knew of this family and what we found at the scene just didn't add up.
Just 3 months earlier, the dead couple's grown-up son was hailed a hero for rescuing his nephew and father from a submerged car. Although the close-knit family had survived this horrific car accident, they would soon be torn apart forever.
For something like that to happen to such lovely people, it's just shocking, terrible. It's the worst thing I've heard.
A complex police investigation would eventually lead detectives to a surprising prime suspect, driven to depravity by greed. Templey in Altrincham, Cheshire, a suburban commuter village on the southern edge of Manchester.
Templey is a small village situated on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, close to the Cheshire Belt. In general, it's a low-crime area.
It became home to Robert and Patricia Seddon, who married in 1966 and settled here to raise their son Stephen and his younger sister Leslie.
Bob worked for British Airways at ground maintenance, liked to laugh, but he got on with his job. He did all the jobs that we did at the time, which was pushback, meeting the aircraft in, putting ground power on the aircraft. So anything that was required, Bob would do. I know Pat was a cleaner, and Bob used to tell me all the time that, he didn't have to worry about the house when he got back, because it was always clean. Bob and Pat both worked hard, but they also liked, their own time, so they'd have friends round and play cards at home, and they did that on a regular basis. They enjoyed that. Bob's favourite pastime was crown bean bowls. He just used to love playing in bowls. All he ever talked about was bowling. Bob was quite private, but we'd talk about his family. He loved his family.
In 1975, when Leslie was about 7 years old, she became ill. Her condition deteriorated and she started suffering convulsions. Doctors diagnosed her with having epilepsy.
Bob loved his children, but particularly Leslie. There was a special bond there between those two. He used to tell me about that all the time.
As Leslie grew up, she adapted well to the epilepsy, and that didn't take a smile off her face. She was a bubbly, jolly young lady.
In contrast, Bob and Pat's eldest child, Stephen, was difficult as a teenager. He got involved with the wrong crowd.
When Stephen was growing up, he started getting friendly with some people who were into low-level crime, taking bites, little things from the house, and he did get into trouble with the police.
Pat and Bob found it difficult to keep Stephen under control.
Due to Leslie's epilepsy, a lot of attention was drawn to help her, and Stephen, at the time, didn't like it and decided that he wanted to look elsewhere.
Stephen's persistent offending landed him in more and more trouble with the police, which didn't sit well with Bob.
Even though Stephen had taken the wrong track at the time, Pat was very close to Stephen.
Stephen, what have you done? Oh, come here.
She would have forgiven him for anything.
In 1987, Bob and Pat were given an opportunity to get onto the property ladder. Bob's mother had recently passed away. She lived in nearby Sale. Keen to keep her house in the family, Bob and Pat decided to buy it. Leslie also moved house with her mum and dad. And Stephen, now in his early 20s, moved into a flat in Manchester.
When Stephen got to the age of 20, he seemed to start to turn his life around, going into the business world.
Along with a friend, he decided to set up a consultancy company.
Have a good day.
And business seemed to be going from strength to strength.
Another happy customer, big man.
Well, part of the day's work.
Good lad.
Bob and Pat were over the moon with the fact that he had such a good business going.
Bob and Pat were really proud of what Stephen had achieved, and I know Bob used to tell me he had quite a few nice cars, which made me jealous.
His company involved contacting small businesses and offering to source European and national funding grants for them for an upfront fee of £300.
Hi,
The business was so successful that after only 2 years, £5 million had been collected in upfront
fees. We will make this
fees.
happen for you, and you will not be disappointed.
In 1996, Stephen's good fortune continued when he met a young woman in a Manchester nightclub. Romance blossomed, and it wasn't long before the couple were planning a new life together.
Stephen and his new girlfriend moved to the northeast to the location where her family and friends all live.
Although they felt sad that Stephen would now be living further away, Pat and Bob were busy with a new arrival at home, Leslie's son Daniel. But as the new grandparents were happily settling into their retirement together, they couldn't have foreseen the terrible accident that lay ahead. In 1996, Bob and Pat Seddon were living in Sale, a leafy commuter suburb south of Manchester. Their 20-year-old daughter, Leslie, who had epilepsy, lived at the family home and had recently given birth to a son, Daniel, who was born with severe learning difficulties. The couple's eldest son, Stephen, had now settled down in the northeast with his wife. They had started a family of their own, and Stephen's consultancy business was still proving to be successful.
Stephen's business took off and was doing really well. He seemed to be making a good go of it and becoming a high flyer in the business world. Bob and Pat couldn't have been any prouder.
But all was not as it seemed.
Hello, is Stephen Seddon in?
Who's asking?
Trading Standards.
He's not in at the moment, he's just gone out.
Well, can I know that we need to speak to him? It's a matter of urgency.
I'll let him know.
Thank you.
It transpired in the late 1990s that Trading Standards conducted an investigation that established that Stephen was trading fraudulently.
We will make this happen for you, and you will not be disappointed. Thanks very much.
Despite Stephen and his business partner promising to find companies grants, they had simply kept the £300 upfront fee each business had paid to them without doing anything in return.
Stephen was very persuasive towards people. He could get them to believe what he wanted them to believe, and if he said to his mother and father, this was this, they believed him.
In March 2000, at Teesside Crown Court, Stephen was found guilty of fraudulent trade-in charges and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Eight years passed by before the family was hit with tragedy.
Is Leslie not up yet?
On the morning of September the 7th, 2008, Pat realised that her daughter Leslie had not come downstairs for breakfast.
With Leslie not being downstairs, Pat went upstairs and walked into the bedroom.
Leslie? Come on, sweetheart, we're all waiting for you.
Tragically, Leslie had suffered an epileptic seizure during the night and had passed away in her sleep. She was only 40 years old.
Knowing how much Pat and Bob had looked after Leslie, when she passed away, they were absolutely shattered, the pair of them, and devastated.
Despite the fact that Bob and Pat were in their 60s and now retired, they were incredibly devoted to their 12-year-old grandson Daniel and insisted that he stay living with them at home.
It was suggested to Pat and Bob at the time that Daniel should be put in care, but knowing Bob as I do, that was never going to happen.
Bob and Pat eventually agreed for Daniel to spend a day or two a week with a respite carer named Fergus.
Come on, Daniel.
All right, he's got everything he needs.
See you later.
Pat was a stickler for routine, and every time Daniel would come home, Pat would be stood at the window looking out, waiting for the bus to arrive outside. Bob would either leave the front door open or he would go to the end of the drive in his slippers and wait for the transport to bring Daniel back home.
After Leslie passed away, Bob and Pat made changes to their will, as she was no longer a beneficiary. Stephen had offered to take guardianship of Daniel should anything happen to Bob and Pat. After coming out of prison, Stephen, who was also using the alias of Nick Seddon, tried his hand at several jobs. Unfortunately, he couldn't hold any down, and in 2011, he was unemployed. With 3 children to support, he turned to his parents for financial help.
Bob had released equity from his own home to provide his son and his family with a house of their own. And he'd given £22,500 for deposit on their home and £23,000 cash for Stephen to get him back on his feet.
No matter how upset Bob and Pat had been with Stephen, he was now their only child, and they were happy to help him. They loved spending time with their grandchildren, so wanted to make sure they were provided for. In March 2012, Stephen invited his parents and nephew out for a meal. He hired a car from the northeast and drove 140 miles to Sale. He said he wanted to thank his parents for their generosity and to belatedly celebrate Mother's Day.
It's not his usual car.
Looks lovely though, doesn't it?
You all right, everyone?
You look great, love. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, ma'am. Are you all right? Come on then, we haven't got a lot of time.
Okay.
You all right, Dad?
All right, son.
Yeah, not so bad. You all right, Daniel?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Right. Are we all in?
I think so.
Right, make sure you got your seatbelts on.
Okay, love.
Safety first.
Where's your car then, Stephen?
Nah, just nothing serious with the car. Just it's in the garage at the moment. Just bad timing with today, you know.
It's a nice car though, isn't it, love?
But on the way to the restaurant, disaster struck. As Stephen took a shortcut during their journey, turning to travel alongside the Bridgewater Canal, he suddenly clasped his hand to his chest and appeared to lose concentration.
Are you right,
Slow down, Stephen. Stephen! Stephen! You better slow down, you're going too fast!
Stephen lost control of the car, plunging himself and his family into the dark, cold canal water.
Hello. Hi, I'm driving up Canal Road in Templey, Manchester, and a car has just driven into the canal.
Okay. Is anybody inside, can you tell?
Well, no one's got out. They literally drove towards me and they sort of didn't stop and then they veered off and gone into the canal.
The police received a call to say that a car containing passengers had plunged into the canal in Templey.
People in it? Yeah, I think they're stuck.
2 young lads at the scene from the bank had seen Stephen escape from the car and managed to get himself on top of the roof.
The 2 young boys that were at the scene saw Stephen clamber onto the top of the car, and then they saw him try to smash the car window with his feet.
Witnesses then told us that Stephen was seen to get back in the water, assist his nephew Daniel out of the car, get him towards the bank.
That's it. Come on, keep splashing, keep going. Keep going.
At this point, the police arrived at the scene.
He then returned to the car, helped his father get out of the car. At this point, the police took over the rescue of his father, threw him a line and got him out onto the bank.
Hold it tight, Slack. Hold it tight. All right. You're doing great. Keep your head above water, yes?
Keep moving.
The first thing we heard, we were out and about in the fire engine doing some fire safety, and we heard that a call had come through for a car in the canal.
When I first heard of this incident, it was quite unusual, as it's a once-in-a-lifetime incident to turn out to.
There was a man at the side of the car. He was quite frenzied. He was splashing in the water and shouting for us to get into the water and to get his mother out of the back of the car.
I'm stuck in the water, I can't get out.
They wanted him rescued first so that we could concentrate on his mother.
The fire brigade were faced with a very serious problem. The car was on the brink of sinking.
When a vehicle's trapped in water, the sheer weight of water which is acting up on the doors means that you physically can't open a door.
To gain access to Pat, they had to break the rear window, which accelerated the descent of the car. By the time they got Pat out, she'd already been underwater for a couple of minutes and her heart had stopped.
While firefighters were getting Pat out of the canal, the police took statements from Stephen and his father Bob, who were anxiously waiting on the canal bank.
You seem to have like a seizure or something.
I started getting these pains in my chest, yeah? And then I grabbed hold.
Stephen was explaining to emergency services that he'd suffered chest pains immediately prior to the accident and that had been the cause of it. And while he was doing this, he clutched his chest and fell to the ground.
After Stephen had collapsed at the scene, he was taken to hospital to be checked out. He had numerous tests on his heart, but thankfully they all came back as normal.
While Stephen had escaped the incident relatively unscathed, Pat was in a critical condition and had to be rushed to hospital.
Hey, Stephen.
You all right, Mum? Stephen.
Despite Pat dying at the scene, I'm happy to say that she made a full recovery. Within the matter of a few days, the family were back together at home.
A lot of this was due to Stephen's actions, rescuing his father and his nephew.
You saved your family, didn't you?
Stephen was hailed a local hero.
No, I'm not the hero, am I? I mean, I just save people that I love. That's what you do. Do you know what I mean?
But just 3.5 months after the terrible car accident, tragedy would strike the family again.
You saved your family, didn't you? I mean, you...
In March 2012, Stephen Seddon was hailed a hero for rescuing his nephew and father after driving his car into the Bridgewater Canal in Manchester.
I just grabbed him and pulled him out.
Having been devastated by the loss of their daughter Leslie 4 years previously, the couple was suffering with depression following the car accident. Pat and Bob struggled on through the next few months, trying to put the past behind them. In July 2012, Daniel's respite carer, Fergus, arrived at Bob and Pat's home to drop Daniel back, but found there was no answer.
At 4:30 p.m. on the 6th of July, we received a 999 call from the respite carer of Daniel.
Emergency.
Hello, I'm a short break foster carer for a child. He's not been able to be dropped off at his own house because his grandparents are not answering the door. I've just been round the back and I've seen his grandfather, and he appears to have a gun in his hand.
Police attended the address and the scene they were met with was Pat laying in the hallway with an obvious shotgun blast to the head. Bob himself was in the rear lounge, slouched on the couch with a clear shotgun injury to his chest. and a double-barrel sawn-off shotgun lay across his lap.
Greater Manchester Police thought they could be dealing with a murder followed by a suicide.
First impressions at the scene was that a murder-suicide had taken place, that being that Bob had shot his wife, Pat, and then shot himself.
But Bob's friend and former colleague, Stephen Fawcett, found this theory difficult to believe.
I received a phone call, asked me had I heard about Bob. I hadn't, and he said, yeah, he's killed his wife and then committed suicide. And I couldn't believe it, I was shocked. The other thing was Daniel, to do that and to leave him on his own just didn't fit into the picture I have with Bob and Pat.
Detectives needed to talk to the couple's next of kin.
It was quickly established that the couple had a son called Stephen who lived in the northeast, and obviously it was important that we contact him as soon as possible.
Stephen's son? Yeah, what's up? Can I come in, please, sir?
Dad!
On hearing the news, Stephen collapsed to the floor, was crying and clearly distressed. And then he just stopped.
He's going to pay the mortgage.
Stephen began to express his worries about the house and basically talk about how he was going to cope financially.
Stephen's reaction at the time was unusual, but when you're telling somebody that something so severe has happened to your parents, it is quite hard to judge how people will react.
Have you thought about possibly going to Manchester, sir?
No, I can't go down to Manchester, mate. I've had a drink, haven't I?
It was really important for us to establish the circumstances as to how Pat and Bob died.
The first thing we did was to arrange for a Home Office pathologist and a ballistics expert to attend the scene so that they could check out the theory as to whether this was in fact a murder-suicide.
There was a full forensics team there. We had local officers doing door-to-door inquiries and also officers doing background checks and medical checks on both Pat and Bob.
Detectives soon had a forensic breakthrough in their investigation.
The ballistics expert and pathologist at the scene were able to establish that the shot that killed Bob wasn't a shot he fired himself. The reason for this is that the size of the shot pattern on his chest indicated that the weapon must have been at least 1.5 metres away from him at the time the round was fired.
This would make it impossible for Bob to actually have fired that gun and shot himself, taking account of those distances.
A second factor which supported that this was not a suicide was that the weapon was found neatly placed across Bob's lap. If he'd have held the gun at distance to shoot himself, the recoil alone would have carried that gun away from Bob, and it would have been on the floor somewhere.
Forensic scientists analysing the gun made another discovery, which backed up this theory.
We had 2 people who had been killed, and within the shotgun we had 1 fired round, 1 unfired round. And there was no other fired round in the building. Extremely thorough search of the whole property then commenced looking for this fired shotgun cartridge, and it could not be found anywhere. Whoever had done the killing had removed that shotgun cartridge when they left the scene themselves.
We'd gone from what we thought was a domestic suicide situation to a double murder with an offender out there on the loose.
Hi, it's on me. Interesting one.
Whilst making routine inquiries, officers spoke to Bob's GP, who informed them of a conversation they'd had during a recent appointment.
Hello there, Bob.
Hello, Doctor.
Take a seat.
The doctor realised that there was something that's wrong. Bob actually said to him, "You would not believe me if I told you." And Bob went on to say there were things about that accident that made him really, really concerned. One of them was that he'd had a crook lock in the car with him when this was a brand new car that wouldn't have needed such a device. Bob had said that on a recent visit to his son's house in the northeast, he'd noticed a saved documentary which showed you how to get out of a submerged vehicle. The doctor pressed him, and Bob said to him that he thought his son had tried to kill him in the accident in the canal in March. The doctor found Bob's concern really difficult to digest, but he could see that Bob was very, very distraught by it all.
This was of great significance to us. Stephen, for the first time, became to look like a potential suspect. We then instructed police in the northeast to arrest him, and he was brought down to Manchester.
Stephen Seddon.
Yeah, what's up?
I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Robert and Patricia Seddon.
That's my parents, man. I wouldn't do that. You got it all wrong.
Stephen was taken to Pendleton Police Station, where police had just 24 hours to question him.
Once we'd decided that Stephen Seddon was a suspect in this, as soon as you declare that and arrest someone, that sets our clock ticking.
The pressure was on to get lines of inquiry in so it would be well prepared for the interview process when he landed.
It became quite crucial to the investigation that we established a time of death for Pat and Bob so that we could then work round where Stephen was at the time of those deaths.
We'd already established that Bob had visited his GP on Tuesday the 3rd of July, and from our inquiries locally, what became really apparent was that this was a couple with a very definite set routine, day in, day out. And what part of that routine was that on Wednesday night, Bob would put the bins out for collection on the Thursday, and that hadn't happened.
Pat would do her washing every day. She would put her whites out first. Then once she'd brought them in, she would put her dark washing out. On the Wednesday, the neighbours would say that they saw Pat put her white washing out in the morning, but they never saw her put out her dark wash.
Extensive CCTV inquiries were then commenced, and one of these led to the recovery of footage on a local chippy where Bob could be seen at 5 minutes past 12 on Wednesday the 4th of July, buying what we believe was probably his last meal, the fish and chips. As part of the proof of life inquiries, we looked at the telephony around Bob and Pat's home phone. What became apparent was that Bob had a phone call from social services when he returned from the chippy, and that ended around about 12:24 that day. The first unanswered call comes in at 16:21. An unanswered call doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's died, but it certainly gave us a window to concentrate on.
At this point in the investigation, we knew how Pat and Bob had died, where they'd died, what time. What we didn't know was why they'd died.
During the interview process, Stephen was asked why his father would have said these things to his doctor, and he simply answered.
No comment.
He was insistent that he was innocent and that we'd got the wrong man.
It's a blinking inquiry. That's what it is. I would not murder my mother and father. Period. You got the wrong man.
During this stage of the inquiry, we looked to see who would benefit from the death of Bob and Pat. And when we looked at the will, what became apparent was that following their daughter's death had been changes made, and now Stephen was their sole beneficiary. During Stephen's interviews, he gave us an awful lot of no-comment answers to an awful lot of questions. But one thing he was happy to talk about was his movements the week his mum and father had been murdered.
And I did actually go to the ring.
Stephen told investigators that he took his family to a caravan park in Fleetwood on Monday the 2nd of July, approximately 2.5 hours drive from where they live. On the Tuesday night, Stephen remembered that he needed to sign on at the job centre in Seaham, so he left Fleetwood early Wednesday morning to travel back home.
So I get home and I'm like knackered, aren't I? So have a couple of drinks, cappuccinos, waiting for me 10 o'clock to sign on. I've dozed off, haven't I? And then I wake up and it's like, Christ, the car is stuck with the electric garage door down. Obviously, I couldn't just jump in the car, otherwise I could have left at the last minute.
Stephen explained that he ran to his appointment at the job centre, after which he took money out from a nearby cash point where he said he would be seen on CCTV.
He then went home for the rest of the afternoon where he said he had another sleep. When the electricity was turned back on later in the evening, he was able to recover his car from behind the gate, go to a local shop, buy some beer, and then drive back down to Fleetwood to rejoin his family.
This meant that Stephen had an alibi from first thing in the morning, from going to the job centre and to the cash point, to buy the Chinese beer in the afternoon and going to Fleetwood. What he didn't have was an alibi between the two times, which was around 11 and 4:30.
The police carried out inquiries on Stephen's mobile phone.
And what it showed us is that Stephen's phone was in Seaham all day.
This put a question mark over him as a suspect in his parents' killing.
At this point, Greater Manchester Police had no evidence to place Stephen Seddon at the scene of the crime in Sale. In fact, it appeared he was 145 miles away in the northeast and without access to a car. Working with the police in County Durham, officers were tasked with verifying Stephen's alibi for Wednesday the 4th of July. Detectives started gathering CCTV footage together. They were able to determine that Stephen did indeed leave the caravan site in Fleetwood early on the Wednesday morning, as he had said. And from speaking to staff at the job centre, they corroborated Stephen's account that he had been in Seaham for his appointment at 10 a.m. and that he'd arrived out of breath because he'd had to run to get there on time.
We then had a breakthrough. When officers viewed the CCTV footage from the CM Job Centre, on one camera you could see in the distance a car pull up and someone emerge from that vehicle and start making their way towards the job centre. On another camera we then see a person who's clearly Stephen Seddon entering the building. What was interesting was that when Stephen left the job centre, he was last seen heading off in the direction of that car. And very shortly later that car is then seen to move off. If Stephen was using a car that day, we needed to know which car it was. Unfortunately, the footage was not of a quality where we could identify the vehicle, but what was apparent was that a bus had driven past whilst he'd been in the job centre. We were really pleased to see that the CCTV on the bus had captured an excellent image of this vehicle. The only negative aspect of the CCTV footage from the bus was that we couldn't make out the number plate, therefore we weren't able to run it through our systems. What we could clearly see was that this was a 3 Series BMW in blue, and what we really needed to establish was this vehicle connected to Stephen Seddon.
Police began questioning Stephen's family and friends in Seaham to gather more information.
Part of the inquiry up in the North East was to speak to all of Stephen Seddon's family.
Can you tell me when you last saw him?
Whilst interviewing his brother-in-law, he actually mentioned to us that on the morning of the 4th of July, Stephen had called at his house and asked him if he could borrow his car in order for him to go to the job centre.
One of the officers was very interested to see that this particular person owned a blue 3 Series BMW. This was a pivotal moment in the inquiry because despite Stephen telling us on interview that he didn't have access to a car, he clearly did.
The police knew that to drive from Seaham to Sale in Manchester would take around 2.5 hours.
What we could establish was that Bob and Pat were probably killed between 12:30 after the last phone call received by Bob and 16:21, the phone call that was never answered.
This is what we would call our window of opportunity. If we couldn't place Stephen Seddon or the vehicle that Stephen Seddon had access to in the Sale area at that time, our own inquiries would ultimately alibi him out as a suspect.
Investigators searching for the killer of Bob and Pat Seddon began to trawl through CCTV footage and automatic number plate recognition systems in both the North East and around the Greater Manchester area.
What we were able to find is a vehicle similar to the blue BMW coming along Manor Road, which is close to Pat and Bob's home, at about 13:35 hours. We then found some further CCTV. This was at 13:59 hours, and this was coming away from the family home of Pat and Bob. At 14:03, the vehicle went past the convenience store again. And then I got the phone call to say that the automated number plate recognition system had picked up a BMW that had gone from the North East to the Greater Manchester area, and this was within our time frame of the killings.
Discovering that Stephen was the sole beneficiary of his parents' estate, the inconsistencies in his interviews, and the evidence placing the blue BMW in the Manchester area during the window of the murder was enough for Greater Manchester Police to seek charges against him. But they needed more evidence to secure a conviction.
All throughout the investigation, one of the things that we couldn't dismiss at all was what Bob had told his doctor.
Was it a very freaky set of events, or was it actually Stephen Seddon's first attempt at killing his parents?
There were certainly a number of inconsistencies that hadn't been considered previously, which we now concentrated on.
The female witness who phoned 999 said she thought a joyrider was driving towards her because of the speed at which the car was travelling. But Stephen claimed he had lost control of the car because of the sudden chest pains he was having, so it's conceivable that he might have been driving erratically before crashing into the canal. It emerged that Stephen had carried a knife in his pocket, which he used to cut himself out of his seatbelt. He'd also brought a crook lock in the car with him that night, despite being in a hire car which had an immobiliser alarm. He was able to use the lock to smash his way out. But for some reason, didn't use either device as a way of helping others out of the car. The schoolboys who had watched in horror at the side of the canal claimed they had to scream for Stephen to get off the top of the submerged car because he was causing it to sink further. And when Stephen was stood on the side of the canal, he relived the accident before appearing to faint. Stephen underwent a number of medical tests on his heart that evening, but everything appeared to be completely fine.
Part of our investigation into the canal incident was to speak to the car hire company. We were able to establish that Stephen had not only hired a BMW, but a couple of days before he'd hired another vehicle as well for a family party. The car hire company informed us that Stephen had taken accidental insurance out when he hired the vehicles, but only on the car that crashed into the canal.
When you added together Bob's comments to his doctor about his suspicions in relation to the crash, Stephen's varying explanations about why the crash had happened, his heart condition that couldn't be detected, his added insurance on the car that was ultimately going to wind up in the canal, this all strongly pointed to the fact that Stephen had, in March that year, tried to kill his family by driving them into the canal.
There were just too many coincidences for the crash to have been an accident.
On the 12th of July 2012, we charged Stephen Seddon with the attempt murder and murder of his father, Bob Seddon, and his mother, Patricia Seddon.
Greater Manchester Police were successfully able to charge Stephen Seddon, but they needed to gather a lot more evidence for the jury to be as convinced of Stephen's guilt. Police investigating the deaths of Bob and Pat Seddon had charged their son Stephen with their murders, along with an earlier attempt on their lives when Stephen crashed the car they were travelling in into the Bridgewater Canal.
We now had enough evidence to bring charges against Stephen Seddon, but we did now have to start putting the case together to bring it before a court. Part of our investigation would be to speak to everybody that knew Stephen in the Seaham area. Some weeks before Pat and Bob were killed, Stephen was drinking in the Mitchell Arms and the landlady was talking to him.
Unless they find somebody to buy it soon, I'm going to lose my home and lose my job.
Hearing about this opportunity, Stephen decided he would like to buy the Mitchell Arms in Seaham and try his hand at being a landlord.
Stephen even went as far as to meet with the owners to discuss the purchase of the pub, and the owners actually believed that he was financially viable and that he did have those funds and that purchase was going to go ahead.
The police took a closer look at Stephen's financial situation.
The investigations into Stephen's finances showed us that he had only about £5 in his account when we arrested him. He was really close to the breadline. He was on benefits, and this was despite his father giving him £23,000 some months before. All that money was gone, and he really was in quite dire straits when it came to money. He had no savings whatsoever and certainly didn't have any of his own finances which would enable him to buy a pub such as the Mitchell Arms.
The police were still unsure at this stage how a sawn-off double-barrelled shotgun found its way into the home of Bob and Pat.
It didn't have any serial numbers on it, which caused us problems. So what we did was we started to look at domestic burglaries and see if a weapon of a similar type had been stolen recently. And we actually found one in a place called Crook. We took a photograph of the gun to the owner of the weapon and he immediately recognised it without any shadow of a doubt. Now the interesting thing about this is that Crook is a village in the northeast and it is a short distance from Seaham. So how did a gun from the northeast wind up in Bob Seddon's lap?
The final pieces of evidence the police needed to examine were Stephen's phone records on the day of the murder.
From telephone records we can tell that Stephen rang the home of Bob and Pat that Wednesday morning. We'll never know what was actually said in that conversation. What we suspect happened was that Stephen made that call simply to ascertain that Bob and Pat were at home and what their plans were for that day.
When we were investigating the phones, one of the things that really concerned me was the fact that his phone was in Seaham and we'd been able to establish that that phone had possibly been answered. This was an area that when it went to court he could use as a defence to say that my phone was in Seaham, it was answered and I answered it.
Stephen was getting an awful lot of texts and calls, which was usual for Stephen. What was unusual was that these were going unanswered, all but one. And what was troubling for us is that we knew at that time the phone was in Seaham and we believed that Stephen was on his way, travelling south to kill his mum and dad. So how was that phone answered if Stephen wasn't with it? What was also interesting was that a lot of these unanswered calls were from loan companies, and as it transpired, the one that had been answered was from a loan company.
We found out what the businesses were and obviously asked them if they had recorded these calls, which thankfully for us they had.
At this point, Stephen was regularly using the alias Nick Seddon.
Can I speak to Nick, please?
You'll have to phone back later.
Is he not available?
No.
All right, we'll give him a call later on then.
Right, try.
We were able to recover a call that Stephen Seddon had answered to another loan company a couple of days earlier.
I'll speak to Nick.
Speaking.
Hi Nick, just a quick call to see if you're interested in going ahead with the loan application today.
Does it charge you money though, before you get the loan or something?
We do charge a fee and guarantee you a loan.
Yeah, I've heard all that before, it's a scam. No, thanks.
When we compared those two audio files, they clearly weren't the same person.
The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together, and Greater Manchester Police felt they had a clear picture of what had happened on Wednesday the 4th of July 2012.
What we believed had happened is that Stephen Seddon took his family down to the caravan in Fleetwood on the Monday so that they would be out of the area. Stephen knew that it had to be in Seaham to sign on the Wednesday morning, and he also knew that the electricity company were going to turn the power off that day because he received a letter some weeks earlier telling him that.
He parked his car behind the electric garage gate, knowing it would be trapped inside.
Despite Stephen telling us that he had no vehicle, he borrowed his brother-in-law's car, which he took to the job centre.
CCTV footage showed Stephen drawing cash out of a cash point.
The BMW was then picked up on CCTV, driving towards another family member's address, where Stephen planned to leave his mobile phone. He then drove down to Manchester, taking a detour on the way to buy the gun from an associate.
He arrived at his mother and father's address at approximately 13:40 and crept through the back door.
He aimed the gun towards his father, and before he had a chance to get out of the chair, Stephen shot Bob in the chest.
We believe his mum was hoovering upstairs at the time, and having heard the noise, made her way downstairs to investigate.
Bob? Meanwhile, Stephen reloaded the gun, removing the empty cartridge which he kept hold of. He then confronted his mother in the hallway.
Oh my God, no!
Stephen then placed the gun in his dead father's lap to give the impression that it had been his father who had fired the shots.
Stephen then left the house and drove back up to Seaham.
Having arrived back in Seaham, Stephen had travelled to a local retail park where he met up with a family member to recover his phone.
He returned home, by which stage the electricity was back on and he recovered his car from behind the electric gate.
He's then seen to go towards a store where he buys some beer, and he's seen on CCTV chatting on his phone. He stopped at a petrol station to get petrol before carrying on to Fleetwood.
Stephen's trial began on the 20th of February 2013 and was held at Manchester Crown Court, where he pleaded not guilty. His explanation for being in Manchester on Wednesday the 4th of July was that he was on a drugs run near to his parents' house at the time they were murdered.
This is a really difficult case because you have to convince 12 people on a jury that a son could murder their mother and father, and the motive being money.
Stephen Seddon was a salesman. He was a con artist. He manipulated people, and it was a worry that he'd be able to convince enough jury members that he was an innocent man.
35 days after the trial began, the jury made their decision. After 18 hours of deliberation, the jury found Stephen Seddon guilty of the murder and attempted murder of his parents. He was given a 40-year minimum sentence without parole.
When the guilty verdict came back, I was very, very pleased.
He really did think he was smarter than the police and he was going to get away with this.
Stephen is money, money, money. All he wants is money. Money, as they say, is the root to all evil. In this case, it shows.
Had Stephen got away with this crime and pocketed the money from his parents' estate, how quickly would that have lasted him? And if he spent it at the rate he'd spent money that his father had gave him, within 18 months, 2 years, he would have had nothing left.
And despite resolving the case, detectives were still left with a final concern for the elderly victims.
We hoped that at the time they were killed, Bob and Pat didn't understand who was doing this to them, that he wore a mask or a balaclava or whatever, because I thought that they, at that moment, recognised their son as the person behind the gun is horrific beyond words.
Bob and Pat, they were lovely people, worked hard all their lives, looked after, all the family. And for something like that to happen to such lovely people, it's just shocking, terrible. It's the worst thing I've heard.
A loved one taken without warning.
It sort of tips your world upside down.
A tragic accident or a brutal, calculated murder.
Why would somebody want to do that? And then suspicion started to mount.
A desperate need to secure vital clues.
We don't exactly know what's occurred. Without that, we're losing valuable evidence and we're losing time.
A fairy tale marriage that was to be tragically cut short. In the foothills of the beautiful Derbyshire Peak District, the market town of Chesterfield is a busy commercial hub, famous for the twisted spire on its parish church.
Chesterfield is your average town. We live in a predominantly rural county. It's got your normal crime level and incidents as you would expect.
Over the years, there has been serious violence and things like that, but it is very rare to Chesterfield.
The town was home to Colette and Christopher Daffin, who grew up, met and married here in 1993.
As a family, they was happy to be together, happy in life, happy just as a normal family.
But in July 2009, their happy family life was to be shattered forever. Colette Daffin was born in 1965 and grew up with her mum Maddie and dad John, along with her brother Chris and sister Jane in the Claycross district of Chesterfield.
She was the one that had the cuts and bruises. She ought to have been a boy. She used to crack jokes, and I think that come from her dad, though.
Colette was like any normal child, ever so fun-loving. When we had Chris and Jane, she was always the one to take them under her wing, sort of thing. She was absolutely ideal daughter. You couldn't wish for one better.
In time, Colette's parents separated and she went to live with her mum and her mum's new partner on Private Drive in the Chesterfield suburb of Hollingwood. In her teenage years, Colette met a boy and became pregnant. The relationship did not last and Colette was left to bring up her newborn son, Richard, alone.
We looked after her, just up to you.
Colette was a real natural mother. She was so loving, as mothers are. I think she had the same difficulties as most single mums. Money were a little bit tight, but she did go to work.
Colette got a job serving behind the bar at the local pub, the Hollingwood, and it was on a night working here that Colette met Christopher Daffin. The couple got on from their first meeting and soon became a serious item.
When Colette met Chris, she seemed happy. So if she's happy, I'm happy.
I thought Chris was a fine lad. From the day we met, we never had a bad word. I'd never heard really a bad thing about him. He's a guy that you'd like your daughter to meet.
And the couple became closer still when Colette gave birth to their son, Jason. Shortly afterwards, Christopher and Colette announced they were getting married.
When she came and told me that she was getting married, I just went, whoopee, you know.
They seemed very happy together. I mean, they got married in a Methodist church at Staveley. And, you know, they were all happy and that, smiling. So, I mean, as far as I was concerned, it was a good day.
Colette was absolutely radiant on her wedding day. She was so happy. Life had taken off, I think. You know, everything was... everything I suppose a young girl dreams of was it was happening. She just looked so beautiful and she looked so happy.
I think to Colette it was the happiest day of her life. She did look really happy.
Love and to cherish. Till death us do part.
But on that magical day, no one could have anticipated that an early death would tragically end this beautiful marriage.
What's taking place now, you would never, ever dream that that would ever happen.
16 years after the couple's perfect wedding day, what appeared to be a routine road traffic collision turned out to be far more sinister. Christopher and Colette Daffin married in the town of Chesterfield in 1993. After 16 years of marriage, Colette was 43 years old. Christopher was 42. With their 2 children, Richard, 24, and Jason, 16, they were the picture of the regular family living on an average street. Chris was an electrician and Colette worked alongside her mum at a local hotel.
They wanted somebody as a waitress like, and I approached Colette and said, do you want to come and wake up and be with me, you know, on my breakfast shift? So she says, oh, that'd be nice, Mum. I says, well, just go up for an interview. I says, and I'm sure you'll get a job. And she did. So we were all happy together, you know, it was a good environment to work. We all got on well.
When their eldest son Richard moved to Cumbria for work, Colette, Chris and youngest son Jason moved to a new house on Cedar Street.
When she moved to Cedar Street, she only lived just at hop, skip and a jump away from where I live. So we both found it easy to get to work because it was only a walk.
In fact, Colette's short walk to work would pass the very pub where she and Chris first met many years before. Early in the morning on the 8th of July 2009, Chris and Colette Daffin woke to an empty house. Their son Richard had moved to Cumbria for work, and their second son Jason was on holiday with family friends. Like most other mornings, they sat down to have breakfast together before going their separate ways for work. However, this morning, Chris decided that he was not going to go straight to work.
You don't mind if we go fishing, do you, this morning?
No, that's fine.
Sure.
Instead, he was going to go fishing at the local canal, just a couple of hundred yards from their home. With Chris gone, Colette got herself ready and left for work as a breakfast waitress around the usual time of 5:45 a.m. Her usual route to work was down Cedar Street, along Pine Street, and continuing down Elm Street to the Ringwood Hall Hotel. Around this time, dog walkers noticed a man behaving strangely on Private Drive.
Witnesses at that time, a couple of dog walkers had come forward and been identified who walk the dogs the same time every day. And they'd identified something really unusual, which was a man hiding in the bushes near the Hollingwood pub wearing a grey hooded jacket and possibly sunglasses. And they'd never seen this man before, and it was unusual for somebody who appeared to be quite furtive, walking away and then going back to the bushes. So his whole demeanour was quite suspicious.
As she approached Pine Street, Colette received a phone call. Possibly as a reaction to this call, or distracted by it, Colette didn't turn down Pine Street as usual, but headed towards Private Drive, a slightly longer route to work.
I used to go to work a bit before Colette, because with me being supervisor, I'd got a bit first there. So she used to pole in probably about 10, 15 minutes later. She was always happy-go-lucky when she come in. She was a bright breakfast up.
However, Maddie wasn't at work that day on the 8th of July, as she had booked a day's leave. Colette Daffin never arrived at work that morning either.
Well, as I arrived at work on the 8th of July, the first thing I was notified was that there had been a fatal RTC, a non-stop road traffic collision where the vehicle had collided with the pedestrian and driven off. So it's still a suspicious incident, something we'd treat very seriously.
When Chris Daffin arrived home at about 6:30 that morning, he received a call from one of Colette's colleagues asking him where Colette was, as she had not turned up for work.
All right. Well, she left at the normal time.
Christopher made a call to the police, and the phone call to us was very much my wife's not turned up for work.
The police told Chris there had been an accident on Private Drive, which Superintendent Debbie Platt was monitoring.
What we'd do is road policing would take lead for the investigation, supported by a detective inspector. And we would lock down the road. We would try and identify the deceased, obviously.
The fact that Hollingwood was such a close-knit community meant officers at the scene were quickly able to put a name to the deceased.
There was a witness who came forward very, very close by to the actual reporting of the incident, who basically says, I know that person, I know who it is.
The body was identified as 42-year-old, mother of two, Colette Daffin.
You've then got the distressing part of this job, which is having to speak to the family face to face.
I was sat in the kitchen, I sat in my dressing gown, having a cup of tea, and this knock come to the door. I could see it was a policeman and a policewoman. And they told me that there'd been an accident. I said, where is she? He said, I'm Private Drive. I said, no, we can't because Claire don't go that way. I can't remember anything from there.
An officer was also dispatched to inform Christopher Daffin that his wife of 16 years was dead.
Hi, Chris Daffin?
Yeah?
Can I come in a bit, please?
Yeah.
The initial family liaison officer, he went to Christopher's address. He wasn't too sure about Chris's reaction. For all intents and purposes, his wife's left to go to work and she's been involved in this collision. And there was just something that just didn't seem to be right. It didn't show that much emotion.
I appreciate that people deal with grief very differently, and he'd had the most distressing news you could possibly take. But his responses and lack of engagement were a worry.
On hearing the news of Colette's death, Chris went to call on his mother-in-law, Maddie, as news of the accident spread to other members of Colette's family.
Around about 9 o'clock, I was informed by my manager that what had happened, and he actually brought me home, and somebody else brought my car. And then I walked in the house, and I don't think for 1 minute there was anybody in the house. They all seemed to be outside on the patio, and I walked out to see Maddie. She was devastated, and at the time, her and Chris were sort of putting their arms around each other, consoling each other. I didn't know what to do myself. I was sort of, I don't know how to put it really. I thought, what can you do now? I mean, and I ended up having to phone everybody up. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
He says, there's been an accident. I says, yeah. He says, it's your Colette. I says, right, I'll be over as soon as I can. When I've just, I'll sprint car back round, and he said, no, it's fatal. So, only thing I thought to do was ring my dad up.
I just says, how are you, Chris? Everything all right? And he says, no. And that's when the news came out. Sorry. But it sort of tips your world upside down.
he screamed. I can hear that scream now.
When he told me Colette had lost her life, yeah, that's not good.
When I found out that it was a hit and run, I thought Chris would be absolutely fuming, as well as losing his wife that morning, you know, a few hours ago. We found out it's a hit and run. It's still clear in my mind now as it was over a year ago, and it won't go away. But something I'll have to learn to live with.
Detective Inspector Rick Alton was starting to piece together the events surrounding Colette's death.
The main thing that I needed to look at is setting off enquiries to actually try and locate the actual vehicle that had been involved in the collision.
Again, a member of the local community was able to assist the police. He was travelling about 80 yards behind the offending vehicle when Colette was mowed down.
The make of the vehicle is a Vauxhall Frontier, and it was like the maroon, burgundy maroon red. We was quite fortunate to have a witness account that basically followed the Frontier down the road. As the vehicle was travelling down, it took an aggressive action towards the pavement, which again, building that in against the camber of the road, would suggest to me that we was going to change this from not an average hit-and-run accident where somebody had been involved in a collision and then gone out of sheer shock. It was quite obvious that this was going to change to a murder investigation.
Investigations at the scene were also revealing evidence that was to become significant in the inquiry.
In the bottom of the hedgerow was part of the registration number L5, and trying to match that with the Vauxhall Frontier, and that gave us quite a significant lead in relation to tracing the vehicle.
The police national computer came up with 66 red-coloured Vauxhall Frontier vehicles with a registration starting with L5 in the Greater Chesterfield area.
An intelligence officer would obviously identify all of the 66 vehicles, identify the addresses, and then there would be actions to different officers or to different force areas to find out what movements that vehicle's taken.
One of the leads detectives followed was that 6 months earlier, a Vauxhall Frontier, matching the exact description of the vehicle that killed Colette, had been repeatedly reported as abandoned around the Clock Tower Business Centre in Chesterfield.
I was made aware that from the intelligence officer that a red Frontier had been seen at the Clockhouse Tower, which isn't too far away from the scene. And that was an abandoned vehicle report where a number of different people have rung in to say this vehicle's parked on private land, but clearly has got no MOT or tax and was causing an obstruction.
But on the day of Colette's death, searches for the Frontier in and around the Clock Tower Business Centre proved fruitless. With police believing this was now a murder inquiry, a specialist family liaison officer from Derbyshire CID was appointed to the Daffin family.
I was asked to note anything that I thought was suspicious. The time I spent with Christopher, my gut reaction was that something was not right. The behaviours he displayed, things he did, didn't seem to me to be the behaviours or the actions of a man who just found out his wife had been killed. I just remember him being distracted and looking back quite cold on that morning.
Back at the scene of the crime, further evidence was being uncovered.
Colette has obviously come to rest once the vehicle's taken off at approximately where we are now, but the critical points for us as the investigating officer and me myself is the fact that in her left hand she had a mobile phone which had obviously suffered during the impact from the Frontier and was broken in several pieces. the alarm bells start to ring, who's she been in contact with or who's tried to contact her. So for me to obtain that phone data would give me a line of inquiry to actually find out who she's been talking to and the length and time of the calls as well, which starts the investigation going and gives it some focus.
Police were about to obtain information from Colette's crushed mobile phone that could quite possibly tear Colette's family apart. The market town of Chesterfield, lying in the foothills of the Derbyshire Dales, was home to Colette and Christopher Daffin, who married in the town in 1993. On the morning of the 8th of July 2009, Colette made her usual walk to work at the nearby Ringwood Hall Hotel. But Colette's journey was cut short at around 6 a.m. that morning, when she was callously run down by a red-coloured 4x4 that failed to stop. Investigations at the scene led police to believe that this was not a road traffic accident, but a murder. And the fact Colette was on the phone around the time of her death led the police to request her phone data.
The mobile phone became very significant in itself because when we'd done some call data, it became then evident that there had been 2 calls from Christopher Daffin's to Colette Daffin, mobile to mobile, and Colette Daffin back to Christopher Daffin. And these calls were between 5:30 in the morning and 6 o'clock. And we believe she was killed around 6 o'clock that morning. So those 4 phone calls and that contact between them is very significant. And it was more significant because Christopher Daffin never told us about any of this.
However, Christopher Daffin did tell police that, as part of his electrical business, he rented storage space at the Clock Tower Business Centre. The same centre where a red Frontera had been spotted abandoned in the months leading up to Colette's death.
Information came in that Christopher Daffin had got a lock-up in the Clockhouse Tower. That then became quite critical information for me, and Christopher Daffin's status as a suspect was massively raised.
Senior Officer Debbie Platt called Family Liaison Officer Nicola Clark and Detective Constable Dave Portas to the scene, where they were briefed on the latest developments by Detective Inspector Rick Alton.
One of the inquiries that I wanted Dave to do when he went to support Nikki is to obviously find Christopher. Twofold: one, to get him away from the family, because I knew which way I think this investigation is now starting to go, and secondly, to obtain his phone.
About 20 minutes past 1 on that afternoon, we arrived at Maddie's house, Colette's mum's. But Christopher left. He'd left the house and he'd told them he was going to walk the family dog, and he'd gone home. So our next move obviously was to go to 5 Cedar Street, the marital home of Christopher and Colette Daffin.
Hi Chris, I'm DC Dave Portas. Can we come in and talk to you?
I asked him questions about his movements that morning, and I told him that we wanted his telephone. The only real questions he asked back were why we wanted the telephone. There were no other questions really. And I just explained to him that everything had to be looked into. It was a very serious incident and we needed to look at his phone. I stepped outside the premises and left Nikki with Christopher Daffin, and I telephoned Rick Alton, the DI. I explained to him I got the telephone, the mobile phone. I also told him that something didn't seem right. He was too calm. He wasn't cut up at all about what had happened. Something wasn't right. Something just wasn't right.
Chris, I want you to accompany us to the police station.
He made a decision to bring Christopher Daffin back to Chesterfield Divisional Headquarters to get details of what had happened to him that morning, what his movements were and where he'd been, and what he knew about Colette's movements. He agreed to this, and we set off and we came back to Chesterfield Police Station.
There was concern around how he was behaving with the family liaison officers. There was concern around the vehicle was still outstanding. We still hadn't identified the red Frontera. We knew that Christopher Daffin had got a lock-up at the Clock Tower. We could put an abandoned red Frontier, a similar number plate, to the Clockhouse Tower, and we knew that we weren't dealing with a non-stop collision at that point. If a woman dies in this country, the vast percentage die at the hands of a partner or husband.
But if this was to prove to be a domestic murder, it was not following the usual pattern of events associated with this type of crime.
The issue with domestic homicide, there generally appears to be an escalation of risk before. Somebody would have called, whether it was a neighbour, whether it was the victim, to report domestic abuse. The unusual factor in this case is that there was no history of domestic abuse reported to the police.
On the contrary, descriptions of Colette and Chris Daffin given to the police were of a very happily married couple.
And that, for me, was quite an unusual factor if we were considering him a suspect. Part of me would have anticipated that there would be something there, a motive or something around previous domestic violence within that household, and there didn't appear to be anything.
With no previous knowledge of Christopher Daffin, it was vital that police build a picture of who he was, and more precisely an account of his movements that morning.
Christopher Daffin told me that himself and Colette had slept together that night. They got up in the morning at 5 o'clock. He'd left the house at 5:15 and he was going to go fishing. He said he went to the canal, which is local, only a few hundred yards from where they live, really. He said that there'd been telephone calls and texts between himself and Colette whilst he was at the canal. Something about an errand, she wanted him to run for bread, and that's as much as he said, really. And then, following that, he'd got back home and received a telephone call from Colette's boss at work, and telling him that she'd not arrived for work. So Christopher said he rang the police. He was told that there had been an accident, that somebody would come and see him. He also said that he walked from his house at Cedar Street to the scene, or to where the scene was taped off from, where he was met by a uniformed police officer. He explained who he was to the officer, and the officer took him home. Very shortly after that, I believe, the message was passed by officers that Colette was involved in the accident.
He phoned me once he got down to the police station and basically gave me just a brief account of what Christopher's initially saying, and there was no sign of him going fishing. Nobody had seen any fishing tackle, and if he was fishing when when he'd had the news, it was a very short fishing trip. I'm local to this area. I know Chesterfield very well. I do a lot of mountain biking, and I do that route sometimes down there along the canal at Hollingwood. And I know where he's saying he was fishing that there isn't a signal down there. It just increases my suspicions around whether his account is actually true or not.
With D.I. Alton convinced Chris was lying about where he was at the time of the phone call to Colette, the police decided to take a dramatic step in the investigation.
About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, possibly a bit later, myself, D.I. Alton, who's the Deputy SIO, we sat in a police van and we were just reviewing the evidence, and the picture was obviously building around Christopher Daffin. And obviously to arrest anybody is a serious step and not one that you would ever take lightly. You run through a whole series of questions in your mind, because the impact for this family, if I arrest an innocent man, would possibly be catastrophic. Because not only have we told this family that the mother's died, that their daughter's died, but we're now also going to have to go back and inform them that the man we've arrested is the dad, is their son-in-law, is their son. And that's a really difficult decision to make. But the evidence was stacking up overwhelmingly against Christopher, and it's my duty to account for Colette's death.
And that's when it's the decision, arrest him for the murder. And although, and you say it now, it's quite easy to say, but within that van, there was quite a lot of pressure. Because as soon as we make that decision, not only is it going to focus our investigation in relation to Christopher, What we have to bear in mind as well is that it's going to tear that family, potentially tear that family apart.
We hadn't located the vehicle. Christopher Daffin wasn't wearing a grey hooded top at the house, so there were obviously key pieces of evidence missing. But my view was that there was too much suspicion not to arrest, and we needed then to secure the house, the vehicle. He'd got a couple of vehicles on his drive anyway, and that for me became a key line of inquiry.
The decision to arrest Christopher Daffin only 7 hours after the death of his wife Colette was even a surprise to the investigating officers taking Chris's statement in Chesterfield Police Station.
As I was taking the statement, we got approximately a page and a half through the statement, and I received a phone call from the Alton again. So I obviously left the room.
I'm speaking to Dave Porters over the phone and basically instructed him that this is what we want doing. Christopher's to be arrested on suspicion of the murder of his wife. And there was a bit of a pause. Then the pause went on a bit longer. And I basically had to say to Dave, did you hear that? And it come back, and it was quite obvious that Dave was shocked.
I was taken somewhat by surprise, but I went in, when I got some details off in relation to the phone calls, not tallying with what he was telling us, and other information that had come to light from witnesses. I went into the same room and I arrested him on suspicion of the murder of Colette.
What? You do not have to say anything?
The only thing he says, it was something like, what? And that was the only emotion I saw from him. He never said another word. He never spoke another word. I told him to follow me down to the custody suite, which he did. I led him down there. He never asked a question. He never said a word.
Following the arrest of Christopher Daffin, it was Nicola Clark's job to tell Colette's family that Chris was being held in custody as a suspect in her murder.
As a police officer, having to turn up at the family home and inform the immediate family members that we, as the police, had now arrested a husband who they trusted with the care of their daughter. It was a difficult thing to have to do, and their initial reactions were that they didn't want to believe.
Maddie was very, found it very hard to believe at that time that he could possibly do something like that. And she didn't want to believe it. But I don't know, neither of us wanted to believe it.
I read on the news that they've arrested a 42-year-old man on suspicion of Colette's death. Never in a million years did I think it was Chris that night.
I knew they'd got the wrong man. I mean, why would they arrest Chris? So, of course, I thought, well, he'll be released very shortly, then we'll have a chat.
With Chris Daffin now in custody, police could secure his and Colette's property and search it thoroughly for evidence to link him to the crime. They were also keen to establish a motive.
The home address was sealed as a scene. There was 2 vehicles on the driveway, one of which was a white Vivaro van. Again, that was sealed as a scene. And we also locked down the lockup that Christopher used at the Clockhouse Tower, and then set the parameters of what I was asking staff to specifically look for. And certainly from the home address search, I was looking for a motive.
Is this a domestic dispute that's gone totally wrong? And it's been done out of sheer frustration, pressure? Is it financial? Is there anybody else still out there that could be involved? Bear in mind with somebody lurking in the bushes.
Searches within the house retrieved financial documents which police hoped might point to a possible motive, while officers beginning a search of Chris Daffin's work van were about to make a significant discovery.
Myself and 2 other officers got to Cedar Street. Our intention of being to search a Vauxhall van, which he used for his work as an electrician. And as we removed items from the car and van, they were to be photographed. I
receive a call from the search team that's responsible for the search of Christopher's van, And with what they told me, it did blow my mind to a certain extent. They've recovered items of clothing which matched the description of the man that was alleged to have been in the hedgerow near to the scene, and also underneath that a V5 document which related to a Vauxhall Frontera with the registration which started with L5. So quite hard to believe at that time, and I think after I'd put the phone down from the search advisor, it was very much sit back and have I just listened and heard what he's told me.
The V5 logbook directly linked Chris Daffin to a vehicle that matched the description of the one that brutally mowed down his wife, and the clothes found in his work van were identical to those worn by the man seen acting suspiciously at the scene immediately before the murder.
The fact that we found the old doll with the V5 document and the clothing did feel like a vindication for making the arrest, but you never make such an arrest on a wing and a prayer. You've got to have the courage of your convictions in this type of investigation, but we still needed to find that Frontera. It's got to be somewhere local, and that would be the critical piece of the jigsaw.
And the person the police thought could help locate the Frontera was about to be interviewed by Detective Constables Dave Portus and Mandy Shunburn at Chesterfield Police Station.
It was after 10 o'clock that night we began the first interview with Christopher Daffin. I wanted to know about his family life, but by this time he'd taken advice from his solicitor and he maintained a no-comment interview. Every question that was asked, he replied no comment.
If you're genuinely an innocent individual, you would be crying out to be heard in that police station, and you would be giving us your movements and alibis and people who could assist, and we just got no comment after no comment after no comment.
No comment.
And although, you know, that's a person's perfect entitlement to do that, I just also think it's an indication of guilt of an individual.
When somebody decides to go no comment, although the interviewing officers are very frustrated, I'm frustrated because the family are asking us questions around what's happening and we can't give them an account.
Time was running out and the police required cast iron evidence to charge Chris Daffin with the murder of his wife. They needed to find the murder weapon, the red 4x4, and that breakthrough would come the following day. On the morning of the 9th of July 2009, Colette Daffin's husband Christopher was in custody in Chesterfield. He was being held on suspicion of her murder by running her down in a red 4x4 the previous day. Colette's family found it impossible to believe her husband had killed her.
We thought Chris was a victim. Even how bad I felt, I thought, well, God, he must feel, well, it's ripped my heart out. How was he going to feel?
But Colette's sister Jane had information that would rock the family.
She came and she started saying that she knew about the affair he'd been having with this other woman, and Colette had asked her not to say anything.
It was just horrific, hearing all that. So as well as losing my sister, and like I say, my mum and dad losing their daughter, we have to hear all this.
We'd had information into the investigation team that Christopher Daffin was having an affair, and obviously that did become a line of inquiry in its own right. We arrested the other woman. She'd clarified that there had been a relationship over a number of years, that it had been an on-off relationship, and that it had finished, and that she had no idea whatsoever of his intention to kill Colette. And with her movements and an alibi from other people, we were quite clear that she hadn't been involved in the preparation or the actual act of murder.
Christopher Daffin wouldn't admit that he'd been having an affair. He says he was friendly with this woman, but he wouldn't have it that he was having an affair. It's strange, but when asked if he was having an affair with this woman, he denied it, but when asked if he'd murdered Colette, he went no comment.
Police had arrested Chris less than 7 hours after Colette's death. Subsequent searches of Chris's work van had revealed clothes similar to those worn by a man acting suspiciously at the scene, and a logbook belonging to a red-coloured Vauxhall Frontera, the vehicle used in Colette's killing. A vehicle that the police had yet to trace.
The frustration that we're feeling, because this car is still outstanding, you know, we've looked at everything. We've looked at the intelligence systems, we've looked at AMPR, the number plate recognition system, we've looked at speed cameras. We've had the helicopter up doing all the surrounding area. We've even gone to the extent of asking the fire service, not just in this county, but other counties, if they get any burnt out vehicles.
The car is critical because it's actually the murder weapon that was used to murder Colette. And by finding the vehicle, hopefully we will then have forensics on the vehicle that would connect Christopher to the inside of the vehicle and Colette, sadly, to the outside of the vehicle.
Once again, it was a member of the public that came forward with vital information.
A call comes into the police and it's basically a woman local to the community. She's heard about the incident because of how close the community is, and she's walking down a pathway at the back of a club that's waiting to be knocked down. It's totally derelict, and stuck right underneath the club in like an open garage is the Vauxhall Frontiera. So this is what used to be the Trothley Club, and the day after the murder, this is where the Vauxhall Frontiera was found.
Detectives found petrol and gas canisters in and around the Frontera. They believe it was Chris Daffin's intention to return to the vehicle at an opportune time and, by igniting the canisters, explode both the car and the derelict club, totally destroying any evidence held within it.
For us as an investigation team, that would have been quite a critical point for us, because a lot of the evidence that we found from the vehicle would have been lost within the fire and obviously buried under, as you can see, quite a large amount of the rubble.
DNA and forensic evidence in and around the Frontera undisputedly linked Chris to the vehicle, even down to the shoes he wore on the day of the murder.
The decision to make that early arrest was, in my mind, validated completely, because had we not, we would have lost critical evidence. If Christopher Daffin hadn't been locked up on the 8th, we would potentially have lost the evidence in the white Vivaro van, the grey hooded top, the V5 document, and definitely the Frontiera vehicle. So, you know, in terms of justifying that arrest, and feeling that, you know, it was the right decision to make at that time, you can look back now and think, yeah, it was the right decision to make.
So the decision then is made to charge Christopher in relation to the murder.
Police submitted their evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service, and just before 1 a.m. on the morning of the 10th of July 2009, less than 48 hours after Colette Daffin's death, her husband, Christopher Daffin, was charged with her murder.
Charges are on the 8th of July 2009 at Chesterfield in the county of Derbyshire, murdered Colette Daffin, constant common to make a reply to that charge. I didn't do it for reasons to do it.
When I heard about all this, I thought I could read people so well. I know he wasn't like that initially. He was, he was happy, but at least it just deteriorated to this stage. Once he's messing about with other women, there's no room for three in the marriage.
But detectives were about to uncover the real motive behind Colette's murder.
The specialist departments that we have that can look deep into people's finances. It was one of the financial investigators, Mark, with just an A4 piece of paper and shaking it with a great smile on his face and puts it on the desk and says, look at that. Well, to me, I basically said, well, what am I looking at? Because it's an insurance policy for £250,000.
Life insurance had been taken out on Colette Daffin for a figure far greater than any other previous policy. And police had concerns regarding the authenticity of the signature on the policy.
It came back from the forensics at Birmingham, which basically says that that is not Colette's signature. Which again, when you sit back and you think, this has obviously been planned over a considerable period of time. Again, that gives you your motive.
With overwhelming evidence stacked up against him, Christopher Daffin eventually pleaded guilty to the murder of his wife, Colette. On the 7th of April 2010, Chris Daffin appeared at Nottingham Crown Court for sentencing.
When the judge sentenced Christopher Daffin to 25 years for murder, it's a mixed emotion, really. You know that your decisions, your investigations have been sound, and that's been justified in a court of law. But you're also conscious you sat in that courtroom and there are numerous family members and friends there. And so it's a mixed emotion, really.
She was my daughter and my friend. I rode into her. I just feel lost. Part of me was ripped away. It'll never mend. Nobody knows what it's like for a mother to have to bury a child.
A man drives a car to a place he loves. He's received a call everyone dreads. His life will not be the same again.
It's a total numbness, it's shock. It's, you know, I just got to get there, and I've got to get there as quickly as possible.
He finds the aftermath of murder, love and betrayal. Exposing the truth behind it will require meticulous investigation and cunning.
What is revealed can be very hurtful and painful for everybody involved.
There's a twist to this story. A killer tricked. Covert technology the police can't even discuss on camera.
Technology played a major part in solving this case. Often, it's what the killer least expects that catches them out.
But there's one other element in this story, the very opposite of what the killer expected. You might call it divine intervention. Carshalton Beaches in Surrey, 13 miles due south of central London. Affluent, quietly impressive, calm.
Carshalton Beaches is a very nice area on the edge of London, right on greenbelt land, very much stockbroker belt, expensive houses with an extremely low crime rate. Police are seldom called there to deal with anything of note.
It was a lovely place, and I think we were very fortunate to grow up there. It's a sort of a tree-lined, I suppose it is sort of almost sort of upper suburbia.
The Cosgrove family lived in the heart of the area.
It was a very happy, large family home. I mean, there was 4 children, grew up in that house. It was a nice neighbourhood.
John was one of 4 children. He has a brother, Matthew, one sister called Carolyn, and another sister, who for the purposes of this film, we'll call Sally.
I think probably there was a quite a close bond between the 4 of us.
Their parents, Maureen and Terence, were well on their way to becoming pillars of the community.
They lived in that area for 30 years and she knew most people up and down the road and in the local area.
Both were heavily involved with charities and worked at schools in Carshalton. Terence was treasurer at a girls' prep school, where Maureen helped out voluntarily with the finances, and she was an assistant teacher at a separate Catholic girls' school.
As a mother, she was very supportive. She'd always be there. If you had a problem, you knew you could go to Mum. You know, and she'd be there to pick up the pieces and to help and give the love and support where it was needed. Dad was a very sort of quiet person who kept himself to himself, his thoughts to himself.
In the 90s, with their children grown up, Maureen and Terence were getting used to life on their own.
There you go.
In 2003, their daughter Sally got married, but the relationship didn't work out and she moved back in with her parents. Our story will actually, in some degree, become Sally's story, an account of dark events which befell her and the family. But first, in 2007, and out of the blue, separate tragedy struck. Terence suddenly disappeared.
Mum rang me on the Saturday evening to ask if I'd heard from Dad, because he'd gone out and hadn't come back, and she was slightly concerned about, you know, where he'd gone, what had happened to him. Wanted to see whether he'd come to see my family or whether we'd heard anything from him, which we hadn't.
Next morning, with no sign of Terence, John set off in his car to try to find him, while Maureen, distraught, waited at home.
I told her that he'd probably, you know, just gone off for a drive to clear his head, not to worry, and I'm sure he'd be back fairly soon.
But Terence would not be coming home.
You know, I think we just missed the warning signs that he was feeling very low. We just put him down to him being a bit miserable for a couple of months.
Later that day, Terence was found hanging from a tree in a park at Arundel in West Sussex.
Sadly, whether we missed the warning signs or not, he took his own life. He hung himself. And we'll never really know exactly why. To the family, I mean, obviously, it was an incredibly difficult time. What it did really do is it made us it brought us together, or certainly the rest of the siblings, in kind of just looking after Mum.
The family had no way of knowing, but still darker tragedy lay ahead. It was 2007, and in the South London suburb of Carshalton Beeches, Maureen Cosgrove, aged 63, was coming to terms with the suicide of her husband, Terence, who'd been found hanging. Maureen wasn't alone. Her daughter, Sally, also lived in the family home. Not long after the death of her father, Sally struck up a friendship.
Hey, how you doing?
Whilst having a cigarette, she met a man who was originally from Scotland, but had been living for 11 years in Ireland.
Bus doesn't stop here, you know that?
Do I know you?
No, my name's George. And you are?
I don't know if I should be telling you that.
Why?
George Maben, known as Geordie to his mates, was in his early 40s, jobless, on the dole and disability benefit.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Oh, that fag looks nice. Could really do with one now.
Tell him my name too.
He had children but didn't live with them. He was living with his 82-year-old mother at her house in North Sutton.
That'd be ever so kind of you.
They became an item very quickly. And, you know, one minute she was single, the next minute she's got this new boyfriend called Geordie and everything's great.
I don't know.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
So you grew up around here?
Yeah, collecting sticks.
George Maben immediately stood out from the other members of the family. He came across as quite softly spoken, quite charming and quite eager to help.
I can take you away from them all. You know, we can have little trips.
He was not in work, and not only that, a cause of some friction between him and John in particular, that he didn't seem to want to get any work.
I think part of the reason that the relationship developed so quickly was, well, I guess from his point of view, she was an attractive girl who was a lot younger than he was. I think possibly the attraction was that he was paying her attention. It was only a few months after her father had died. You know, he was there to make a fuss over her and spoil her. You know, he obviously cared passionately about her, and I think we all saw it as possibly, you know, a good thing in her life.
It's not.
Oh, look.
he was automatically included within the family unit and given the same sort of care as 2 sons and 2 daughters.
But within months, George was getting itchy feet. He longed to take Sally to live in Ireland.
He seemed to love this sort of Celtic image.
Late in 2007, they went. But the reality was to prove tougher than they'd hoped. Sally found work as a bookkeeper, but it soon became apparent it wasn't working out.
She didn't keep that job for long.
Do you realise the accounts have to be in tomorrow morning at 12 o'clock?
Yes, I do. I realise that. Yeah.
I understand that the employer got a little frustrated with the fact that Geordie would keep turning up.
In the summer of 2008, Sally and George returned to England and moved in with Maureen.
Geordie didn't want to come back, he wanted to stay out there. She wanted to come back. I guess she was probably missing her mum. Fairly quickly, though, it became clear that it wasn't ideal. He wasn't a lot of help around the house. You know, he didn't work, didn't contribute financially to the household. So, you know, suddenly Mum was supporting him financially. He made no effort to go out and find a job.
Simple things like walking through the living room with the shoes on and not taking the shoes off. Although that was a fairly minor point, it became much more of an issue to Maureen.
Please, I have asked you so many times.
Right, sorry.
These things grew and grew.
There was a summer house in the garden, and Sally and George used this as a retreat, a place where they could spend time by themselves.
George had never had very much. He'd never even had a regular job. He'd struck a little gold mine, really, living in a lovely house with plenty of space, with a family who were comfortably off.
In the late summer of 2008, Sally became pregnant with George's child. But Maureen's patience with George was running out.
Mum, I think, felt that, you know, now that he had the responsibility, or was the responsibility of a partner and a child that was going to be born, he should probably find a job. And I think the fact he didn't led to some friction. Towards the end of the year, she actually limited the time he was allowed to stay. He was only allowed to stay, I think, a couple of nights a week. And at that point, he actually had to go back and live with his mum.
George, why are you being like this?
Sally decided not to move with him to his mother's house, but to stay with Maureen.
Can I help?
No, just leave me alone to pack.
Geordie was obviously not happy that he was no longer allowed to live in the house.
George.
He wanted to be living with this woman that he loved and was very, very possessive over anyway, and was now pregnant with his child. He was allowed to stay at the house occasionally.
Yeah.
Maureen suggested a holiday, taking Sally and her sister. She didn't invite George, who'd created a scene on an earlier trip to Spain with the family.
Well, you know what happened last time.
There'd been an altercation over an attentive waiter.
George got quite jealous and quite angry.
Excuse me, guys. I have some more tapas for you guys. Is everything all right with your food so far? Yeah? Wow. So, que guapa. Absolutely gorgeous.
Hey! Get your hands down.
Calm down, mate. It's a nice compliment.
Just get in the kitchen.
Sorry about that, yeah?
Yeah?
Excuse me, guys. Excuse me.
I think he took that badly. Not that he wasn't going on holiday, I think, but the fact that she would be out of his line of sight.
In the end, that holiday never happened. Events intervened, and nothing would be the same again. At the family home, March the 24th, 2009, began as a perfectly ordinary day. Sally got up, did her morning chores, and watched TV. George spoke to her several times on the phone.
Yeah, I'm good.
They arranged to go shopping, then meet for lunch just off Sutton High Street. Maureen had gone out to visit the dentist, then donate some clothes to a charity shop before heading home. But as the day wore on and Sally prepared to meet George, she tried repeatedly to call her mother but received no reply. Later that day, at the offices in North Kensington in London where he worked, John Cosgrove received a phone call from his brother.
And he said, "You've got to get home." And I kind of said, "Well, why? What's the matter?" And he said, "Oh, it's Mum. I think she's dead." The call from my brother just totally numbed me. It was almost like, it was disbelief, and I think because there was so much uncertainty around, at that point, what had happened, it was just, it was, Mum's passed away, why, how, what on earth is going on? All sorts of things were racing through my mind. My initial thought was that, she'd had some kind of, heart attack or had a fall.
He arrived to find part of the street sealed off.
And I thought, this hasn't happened as a result of some sort of illness or a fall or something. There wouldn't be this level of police attendance. You see that tape, you immediately think crime scene, don't you?
John? I'm really sorry about your ma. I'm so sorry.
It emerged George had met Sally for a drink. They'd done some shopping, then headed to Maureen's house. The accounts of George and Sally as to what happened next vary in detail. This is George's version.
Fancy a brew?
Coffee for me, I think, yeah.
Get in here. Maureen? Maureen?
Mum?
Call an ambulance. Call an ambulance. I'll speak to it. Go on. Maureen, come on, Maureen.
It's my mother. I think she's dead.
Paramedics arrived and confirmed Maureen was dead. They called the police.
I'm just going to phone the police, okay?
Subconsciously, I knew that it probably wasn't death by natural causes or fall, so I was kind of starting to think some sort of confrontational situation at that point.
She's just lying here on the kitchen floor with my mum. Okay.
As soon as the police arrived, it became quickly apparent that Maureen had in fact been murdered. There was clear signs of strangulation.
If they'd said, she'd been pushed over and, cracked her head on the floor or something, you might think, well, that could have happened if there was a bit of a confrontation. But, you suddenly think that your average intruder is just going to want to push her out of the way and get out of the property rather than stay there and strangle her to death, which just really made it even more kind of mysterious and difficult to comprehend at that point.
The cause of death was confirmed as strangulation in a post-mortem the following day at St Helier Hospital.
It was obvious that there had been a sustained compression of the neck using a ligature and that extremely strong pressure had been used. That was the only significant injury to Maureen.
It was an incredibly difficult time, despite the support that the family liaison team gave us. And I think they saw us every day. Very, very unsettling, very emotional. You go from moments of tearful emotion, which I guess is the grief, to anger, frustration.
An initial line of inquiry was that the killing was a domestic incident.
There was no disturbance within the premises. There was no forced entry to the house. Everything appeared in place. I had a strong suspicion this may well be linked into the family and linked into someone who either lived at the house or frequented the house You've obviously got to be open-minded as to who may have been responsible, but you've got to be realistic as well. Someone has killed Maureen Cosgrove in her house. The chances of somebody who knows Maureen Cosgrove and who knows the house, the chances of it being some random psychotic killer who's gone to the premises is extremely low. So we had to be extremely careful about the information which was being released, even to the closest family.
It was absolutely awful because we knew at that point that someone had taken Mum's life. We didn't know how. You don't know whether the attack is of a sexual nature. You've got no idea. And it's just, I think it's just, it's the horror of knowing that someone's taken her life. But at the same time, you know, a great degree of kind of inquisitiveness because you do actually want to know what has happened.
I was asked to go and see them and to explain in fairly brief terms what we would like to happen.
Maureen's sons and daughters were subdued. The response of George was different.
Certainly George, he wanted to know what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, how we were going to find the person who killed his mother-in-law, in effect.
Well, if there's anything you need from us, you know, we can help.
Okay, thanks very much.
Police did reveal to the family certain details about the attack itself.
It was absolutely awful. I mean, I think, you know, in comparison that Dad had died by hanging and then to know that Mum had basically died, you know, in a similar way, but not of our own wish. No, it's just horrible. But at the same time, they were able to confirm that, you know, the attack wasn't of a sexual nature, and that actually was a relief. The only thing I could think of was that Mum had disturbed an intruder.
George, too, speculated there'd been a burglary. He told police several doors in addition to the patio door had been left open, which was out of character for Maureen, who was security conscious.
One line of inquiry we did have was that this may have been a burglary.
George asked Sally whether Maureen's handbag was missing.
We found Maureen's coat next to her, and one would expect to have found the handbag next to the coat. It was clearly missing. We worked with both Surrey Police and the local police divisions to identify patterns of burglary offending in the local geographical area. There was nothing at all that matched the circumstances that I was dealing with. A thorough forensic search of the actual house took place, and at the same time we were looking for the missing handbag. We then started to conduct more thorough searches of gardens, and in an adjoining garden we found Maureen's handbag, which had been abandoned.
The bag appeared to have been thrown across the fence near the summer house.
The contents were examined, and we were surprised to find there was absolutely nothing missing from the handbag. Credit cards, driving licence, substantial amount of cash were all within the handbag and purse. That made burglary seem less likely as an option.
The family liaison officers were asking whether we could think of anybody who might have a grudge against the family, whether there might be sort of, I suppose, any hidden dark secrets in the family that, you know, someone might want to attack Mum.
But then the family got a shock. Police suspicions were falling close to home.
Can I ask you both to accompany me to the station, please?
Police investigating the murder of Maureen Cosgrove, aged 65, in the affluent South London suburb of Carshalton Beeches, had two key potential suspects. One was George Mayburn, partner of Maureen's daughter, Sally. The other, to the family's alarm, was Sally herself. She and George had found the body.
One of the family liaison team rang and said, we are taking them both back into the police station for questioning. Explaining obviously they were, I think what they call like key witnesses because they found the body. But immediately I was kind of, you know, why? What have they done?
As police questioned George, they noted what appeared to be a small friction burn on his forefinger.
As a result of the post-mortem and the confirmation a ligature had been used, I had to consider, could that friction burn have been caused during the application for ligature?
It's nothing, just a wee cut. I was moving a washing machine at my mother's to sort of wedge it out. I just cut my finger, you know, that's all.
Whilst he was still at the police station, his injury being photographed, I dispatched officers up to his mother's house and they examined the washing machine. They found food debris, hair, dust all around the washing machine, and there was cobwebs almost welding the washing machine to the wall. It was quite clear the washing machine had never been moved. No wheels had been turned.
George had lied. Police probed more deeply into the relations between him and the family.
The family liaison officers who are deployed to deal with the family, they're there not only to provide support, but they're also to gather information and any potential evidence. And we started making discreet inquiries as to Maureen, her relationships with family members and associates. It was quite a consistent theme running through the accounts that there was an unhappy relationship between George and Maureen.
Police soon established friction had centred on George's relationship with Sally. They decided to build a detailed picture of the exact movements of the two of them on the day of the killing.
It quickly became apparent to us that everything she told us could be verified. She was where she said she was doing what she said she was doing. On the other hand, the movements of George could not be verified.
He was brought into Sutton Police Station.
When George was interviewed, he was very polite. He was quite an outgoing, gregarious person.
Women, when you know, they're waiting for you, you have to ring them, say, I'm on my way. She's a bit like that, so.
Very cooperative with officers, and he was seeking to give very detailed answers to all the questions that were put to him.
The problem was, no one could remember seeing him at the times and places he'd specified before his meeting with Sally.
By day 2 or 3 of the inquiry, I was becoming more and more unhappy with George Mabin. His account of movements was becoming less robust. The relationship wasn't good. He was coming to the fore as a suspect for me. The account given by George was that he'd been at home in the St Helier area with his mother. He'd been up by the local co-op shop. He had then caught a bus into the Sutton area, into the town centre.
He said he'd waited there for Sally and had eventually met up with her.
If George was lying about his movements, it was important we found out where he really was at the time in question during that morning. We needed some independent, verifiable proof of his story. George's mother was spoken to by officers from the inquiry. She's an elderly lady and she could give no clear, reliable account of his movements. It was highly possibly taking a bus. Most of the buses have CCTV. An obvious line of inquiry was, sees all the bus CCTV in Sutton.
Police started with footage from buses en routes between George's mother's house and the murder scene. The material was analysed in this room at Sutton Police Station.
And lo and behold, George was on a bus.
This is George getting onto the S4 bus. This route for the bus takes him up to the area where the actual offence took place.
He was on the bus travelling towards Sholton Beaches, somewhere where he said he hadn't been that day.
You can see clearly he has no gloves on and blue jeans with white training shoes, and he's got a distinctive hat, a brown coat.
It was a nice warm day, and Curiously, he was very much overdressed for the weather. He was wearing a hat, a heavy coat, and during the course of the bus journey, he started to put on a very heavy pair of gloves.
His hands become visible and there's quite clearly some dark or black gloves that he's now put on while he's been sitting on the back of the bus.
Now, there's obviously a reason for that. It hadn't suddenly get cold on the bus. He didn't need to warm his hands up. Very interesting why he was wearing gloves. In my mind, I had the friction burn on George's finger and the question of the heavy gloves. We made inquiries and established from the pathologist that it was quite feasible that a friction burn could be caused using a ligature whilst wearing heavy gloves.
Police also checked mobile phone records, cross-referencing data from phone masts to pinpoint the position of George's phone.
Hey, George.
Hiya. How you doing?
They tracked his phone from his home area all the way to Cushalton Beaches. On the way, he made several calls to Sally, pretending he was at home, when actually he was very close to the murder scene.
And one of them was extremely sinister in that he'd called up to actually check that she'd left the house and that she was on her way to him in Sutton.
Have you left yet? Have you left the house?
To me, that was him checking to make sure the coast was clear.
George's journey took him to a bus stop near Maureen's house.
This is the time about 9:53 where George crosses in front of the bus camera and walks off towards Maureen's house. This is a time when at first he said that he was still at his mother's address. You can see it's a very quiet street. He's the only one in there. As he disappears out of view, you just see him change direction and cross over to the side of the road where Maureen's house is. Just there, he begins to cross over and then out of sight.
Analysts found evidence of one phone call which was particularly telling. It seemed George had slipped through a side gate and received a call at the bottom of the garden.
All right. Right.
We instructed expert engineers who were able to tell us the exact location of the phone to within a few hundred yards in some cases, but one phone call in particular was extremely relevant. As a result of a geographical anomaly, a valley some 2 to 3 miles away, they were able to pinpoint one call to the back garden.
You in town? Right. Good.
And it was located in a space only 3 or 4 foot wide, directly behind the summer house. And that was the only space within Cushalton Beaches where this particular phone mast hit. The area behind the garden shed became extremely relevant to the inquiry. This was where the handbag was located, next door neighbour's garden, and it's quite clear that it may have been spent some time there. It was a good hiding area. It was an area that he was familiar with. Whenever he visited the house in the past, he'd spent a lot of time there. And from the cigarette butts lying about, it was obviously an area that he used regularly to smoke.
It was a simple step to theorise what happened next.
It's my belief that he waited in the back garden until he saw movement in the house, Maureen having returned from the dentist. He then quite calmly walked up the back garden, knocked on the back door. Maureen would have quite readily admitted him to the house.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Are you in the back?
Can I get a brew?
Coffee?
And once he was in the kitchen, he attacked her and killed her.
Phone records show a call was made from the house landline to George's mobile, but the mobile was in the close vicinity at the time.
This was clearly an attempt by him to throw us off the scent and make us believe that someone from within the house was phoning him and trying to get in contact with him.
Police believe he then threw Maureen's handbag over the fence to make it look like burglary, though neglecting to remove money or credit cards. Then left to meet Sally in Sutton. But proving George was at the scene was one thing, proving murder was another. Police turned once again to CCTV.
Here we see George about an hour after the murder occurred in Sutton High Street, crossing the road. He crosses over towards a bin where he appears to put something in the bin. Here we see a shot from a jeweller's window where he turns away, having put items in the bin, where he walks to a small alcove here. And then you see him take the coat off.
The coat potentially held vital evidence.
He appears to kick it through underneath the gate.
It was quite obvious to me that he was attempting to change his appearance. That coat was obviously very, very important to our inquiry, and it was vital that we get hold of it.
Once again, CCTV provided the lead. The story was about to take a new twist, thanks to a random passerby.
In this footage, you see a male coming down on a bicycle. He gets off the bike and pushes it down the footway, where he goes behind the lamppost and he goes to the Lloyd's cash point. He then picks up the coat and cycles off with the coat, which is dangling over his handlebars.
The bank identified the man who'd taken money from the cash point.
Officers were dispatched immediately to his home address. There they spoke to him, asked him about the coat, and he was able to produce the coat untouched, unworn, still as it was, from when he picked it up a few days earlier.
Once we had actually got the coat back, it was it wasn't a eureka moment in that it really was a significant part of the evidence.
The coat was submitted to the forensic laboratory for examination, both for DNA and for fibres. The DNA was able to prove that George was a habitual wearer of that coat, and the fibres contained upon the coat showed a huge number of red fibres. These red fibres were mainly contained to the arms and the chest area, and these fibres importantly matched the top that was worn by Maureen at the time of her death.
Black fibres, similar to those from the coat, were found on Maureen's top. George's account of finding the body, which in this respect did not match Sally's, attempted to explain the fibres by saying he held her as she lay dead.
I was keen to recover the gloves worn by George. These have never been found by police. George was asked about them. He came up with a cock and bull story, saying that his dog had eaten the gloves. It's my belief that the gloves were put into the bin along with the ligature.
Though the evidence against George was circumstantial, police were confident they had their killer. But there was one lingering possibility they had to resolve.
What I was less certain of was whether he was the only person involved in it or whether he'd an accomplice. And I needed some concrete evidence to prove that one way or another.
If Sally was innocent, police wanted to rule out completely the possibility she was involved. The evidence was to come from the most unexpected quarter. Police believed they'd identified the killer of 65-year-old Maureen Cosgrove at her home in Carshalton Beeches in South London. They had a strong circumstantial case against George Mabon, the partner of her daughter Sally, who was carrying his child. They wanted to confirm beyond all doubt that George had acted alone and that Sally was not involved. Their methods were covert. Police will not even discuss them on camera, and produced results beyond an investigator's dreams. Their ploy began with a crucial piece of information they'd never revealed to anyone: the recovery of Maureen's handbag from behind a neighbour's fence. After the murder, they'd seized Sally's Ford Focus car for forensic examination. Now they handed it back, and just before they did so, in the hope of triggering a telling reaction, they told Sally the handbag had been found and contained evidence which could identify the killer.
The contents inside give us evidence to suggest who the killer of your mother was. We know who's done it? Yeah, we have evidence. Oh, that's the best news ever. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Did you hear that, George? Oh my God. Oh my God, George. Did you just hear that?
Aye.
They think they know who's done it. I can't believe it. Oh, that's amazing news. That's amazing.
What neither of them knew was that the car was bugged. Their reactions alone told police what they wanted to know. After a short time, Sally asked George to pull over so she could get some cigarettes. And it was what happened when she was out of the car that was to prove conclusive in court.
God forgive me for what I've done. I just couldn't take it anymore. Every single day she was breaking me down. God. Oh, forgive me. Please, God. I'm sorry.
Okay, babe.
You alright?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just a bit shocked, you know.
I know. Me too.
Police confronted George with the recording.
God forgive me for what I've done.
Shit.
I just couldn't take it anymore.
George was charged with murder. Police were satisfied Sally was innocent. Her brother, John, was asked to collect her from the police station.
She was just in floods of tears. They took me into an interview room to see her, and she was just floods of tears, saying, you know, it was all wrong. They'd got it all wrong. It couldn't be him. You know, can't I do anything about it? Can I tell them, you know, and it's stupid, and what are they doing?
It's all wrong. They've got it all wrong. Can't you tell them something? Can't you tell them they've got it all wrong?
Just felt so sorry for her at that point, because, you know, the person that had been charged was her partner and the father of the baby she was carrying. And, you know, despite the fact that she was convinced he hadn't done it and that they got it all wrong, deep down you know that the chances are that he probably has. From my point of view, as much as it was horrible to think that, you know, someone that had been welcomed into the family and to a large extent treated as a member of the family could do that, but at the same time there was a kind of relief that we were starting to get an answer.
George refused to let Sally go and kept sending her love letters from prison whilst he was awaiting trial.
He was constantly telling her, you know, he loved her, all the reasons why it wasn't him, and that basically the police just needed to make up their, you know, the numbers they needed to be seen to get a quick result.
In October 2009, George's trial opened at the Old Bailey.
In court, in the presence of the judge and jury, George came across as very meek, very mild, very polite. There was a different side to him when the jury was out of court and the judge was out of hearing. He was cocky, rude and arrogant.
George attempted to explain his confession by saying his mother had been wearing him down in arguments over his dog, and he wanted forgiveness for stealing £50 from her purse.
He claimed that he had no money on him at all. We were able to prove that that was a lie. Not only did he have money on him, but he also had a receipt from a bank ATM where he'd taken £40 out on the morning of the murder.
George was found guilty, but his sentence proved controversial. Judge Roberts jailed him for a minimum of 13 years, 2 years less than the normal tariff for premeditated murder, and 7 years less than the police were expecting, on the grounds the crime was out of character and George had been under enormous pressure and could see no other way to be with the woman he loved. The judge said that this was illustrated by the prayer for forgiveness recorded by police.
No sentence would have been enough, but 13 just wasn't enough for what he'd done. You know, what he'd done to my mum and what it had done to our family.
I consulted with the Crown Prosecution Service and with the QC who presented the case in court. An appeal was made to the High Court and the sentence was increased, quite rightly, to 18 years. George had clearly put some planning and thought into the commission of this murder. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It was something he'd thought about. He'd told lies before it. He'd told lies about his journey. He had the gloves in his possession. One of my officers best summed up his efforts to cover up the crime as saying, "You watched CSI, but you only watched half the episode."
Sally and the other members of Maureen's family are now rebuilding their lives, trying to move on from tragedy.
The last time I saw Mum was the evening of Mother's Day. I went round in the evening, took some flowers and a card, you know, gave her a hug, sat and chatted to her. I do remember as I went out the front door, she followed me out, she gave me a hug, said thank you for the flowers, love you, speak to you later. And I got in my car and drove off. That's the last time I saw her. Well, last time I saw her alive, anyway.
In October 1983, the Nottinghamshire suburb of Keyworth was rocked by the sudden disappearance of 16-year-old Colette Aram.
I just knew Colette so well. She was so predictable. I knew something was wrong. And I knew that I had to phone the police.
As a massive police investigation was launched, detectives became aware they were dealing with a predator intent on committing a vile and vicious attack.
This crime understandably ripped Colette's family apart, and Keyworth itself has never been the same since.
But this was a crime destined to taunt detectives and Colette's family for a quarter of a century.
He would have seen the publicity about this case over the many years and just remained his cool, calm individual that the family thought he was.
I feel like I've been punished. He was getting on with his life as far as I could see, whereas he destroyed ours, he destroyed my family, he destroyed my marriage.
But Nottinghamshire police remained determined to catch Colette's killer, however long it took. The sleepy suburb of Keyworth lies to the southeast of the city of Nottingham.
Keyworth's a very nice village. There is very good community spirit there. I would say it's quite an affluent area.
In the early 1980s, Keyworth was home to the Aram family, parents Jackie and Tony, and their two teenage children, Mark and Colette.
The Arams are a lovely family. Really nice people to know. Love the kids to bits.
And their youngest child, 16-year-old Colette, was the perfect daughter.
She was vivacious, bubbly, a bit giddy at times. She could never see any bad in anyone, and she cared about other people too.
She was a loyal best friend.
Colette was a lovable person, great to get on with. Everybody liked Colette. She was one of these people you could trust.
The 16-year-old was enjoying a new, more independent lifestyle, having recently left school and started an apprenticeship as a hairdresser.
I think she would have been very good in the hairdressing profession. She was quite an arty person, and she was very interested in the beauty side too.
She also liked spending time with her boyfriend.
They'd been seeing each other 6 months, and they were a nice, loving couple, suited to each other.
At just 16, Colette had her whole life ahead of her.
If Colette was here now, I would like to think that she was still this happy, go-lucky, love life, love people person that she was all those years ago.
But in 1983, the Aram family was to experience the most devastating series of events. The 30th of October was just like any other day.
Colette wanted to make cakes. We had our tea together and had some of the cake, and then she went and got herself ready to go out to her boyfriend's.
Colette's boyfriend would usually pick her up in his car. However, on this one particular night, he didn't have the use of any transport.
She came in and said that his car was off the road, and she said it was a nice night and she wanted to walk.
But Jackie wasn't happy with the arrangement.
I said, no, I'm going to take you in the car. And she said, no, Mum, I don't want you to. It's a nice night. I want to walk.
Are you sure?
Jackie refused to back down, but Colette was determined to walk.
Fine, honestly.
Eventually, I said to her, OK, if you're insistent, just be very careful and you make sure that you're home for about 9:30. And she said, OK, Mum, we'll do.
Bye-bye.
Colette left her home at around 7:50 p.m. on Sunday, the 30th of October, 1983.
She put her arms around me and said, love you very much, and I'll see you later. That was it, and she left the house. That was the very last time I saw her.
The walk from Colette's house to her boyfriend's would normally take around 20 minutes. Just after she left, Colette's boyfriend telephoned the house.
He just asked if she was at home, and I said no. She said to tell you that she'd walked up Nicker Hill to your house. And he said, OK, then I'll go on my bike and I'll meet her.
Several minutes later, the telephone rang again.
He phoned back and said, I thought you said Colette was walking up Nicker Hill, but I've been all the way round the village on my bike and I can't see her anywhere. When he said that, the alarm bells went and I just knew something was wrong.
She's not there.
I knew my daughter, I knew her so well, and I knew that if she'd gone anywhere or called in at anyone's house on the way, she would have made sure that she'd have phoned me.
But Colette hadn't called, and Jackie started to panic.
I was thinking that maybe a car or something had hit her and that she was lying in a hedge bottom, she'd been knocked over. And I can remember, I think it was my neighbour who said to me, look, Jackie, this is Keyworth. Stop worrying, nothing like this ever happens. And I said, it might be Keyworth, but there's a first time for everything, and I'm telling you, something has happened to my daughter.
On Sunday, the 30th of October, 1983, 16-year-old hairdresser Colette Aram set out on a simple journey, a 20-minute walk to her boyfriend's house. But when she failed to appear, Colette's boyfriend was instantly concerned and raised the alarm.
I said to my husband, there's something wrong. Colette hasn't arrived at the boyfriend's house and he can't see her anywhere in the village. And I said, we need to phone the police.
Jackie telephoned the police to report her daughter missing.
Please, please.
I didn't feel awkward, I didn't feel embarrassed or anything. I just said, she's missing, she hasn't arrived at where she was supposed to be. And they just said, how can you say a 16-year-old girl is missing at 8 o'clock at night? And I said, easy when it's my daughter, because she's so predictable. Well, they asked me actually, what time does she normally come home? And I said, she's never home any later than 9:30. And they said, OK, well, if she hasn't arrived home by 10:30, phone us back again.
Jackie and her husband Tony were determined to find their daughter and immediately formulated a plan.
I said to Tony, we can't leave it that length of time. You have to go and drive round and see if you can see her.
Meanwhile, Jackie started to phone anyone who might have seen her daughter.
I rang my aunt and I rang my friend who lived en route, and I believe I rang a couple of her friends. It was like everything was a blur because I was in such a panic.
But no one had seen or heard from Colette. Jackie then joined the search.
It got to 9:30 and she still wasn't home. And I said to Tony, I can't stand this any longer. I am not waiting till 10:30 to phone the police again. I have to phone them now.
When the police arrived, Jackie led them to retrace the route Colette should have taken.
The concern kicked in very, very quickly because at that time we didn't know what had happened. We didn't even know if anything had happened.
There was no signs of there having been an accident or a struggle. There was nothing, no clues, nothing. It was like she'd disappeared into thin air.
As they reached the early hours, the police officers were forced to suspend the search. But Jackie's night was far from over.
The police said they'd come the following morning, but we never went to bed that night. We sat up all night, and periodically I'd start to panic and say, you know, what can we do to find her? So I phoned every hospital that I could imagine, and no one had had an accident reported or a girl brought in from a car accident. So I knew that something was far, far more sinister.
Early the next morning, a local man began his drive to work.
A businessman who was just going to a local farm saw what he thought was something suspicious in one of the fields as he went along.
The man turned his car around and drove back down the lane to investigate.
He wasn't sure what he'd seen, but he suspected he'd seen a body in the field.
The man stopped his car.
He saw what appeared to be a naked girl laying in the field. Quite clearly, she was dead.
The businessman did not know the girl, but her name would haunt him forever. He had just discovered the lifeless body of 16-year-old hairdresser Colette Aram.
There was blood at the scene. I believe it was coming from a head wound. It was clear that she had suffered a sexual assault. Overall, it was not a pleasant sight.
Colette had been found just off Thirlby Lane, less than 2 miles from her home. Whilst the detectives were securing the crime scene, Colette's brother and grandfather arrived.
Mark and my stepfather got to Thirlby Lane as the police had actually just putting the cordon up.
Instinctively, Mark jumped out of the car and raced over to the crime scene.
The police tried to stop them from going into the field, but not before Mark was able to get in far enough to actually see Colette lying in the hedge bottom and to see the way she was lying there. What Mark saw has changed his life forever. It's had a big, big impact on his life. He still can't talk about Colette easily these days.
Mark and his grandfather returned home, faced with the horrifying prospect of having to break the news of Colette's death to Jackie and the rest of her family.
As Mark got out of the car, I saw this officer shake his head to the officer at the bottom of the drive. And I knew, as soon as I saw him do that, I knew that she was dead, that my worst fears were true. And I just remember all these screams, really loud screams, my screams.
Whilst the family tried to accept the shocking news of Colette's murder, detectives set up an incident room in a nearby sports pavilion.
I was a young detective at that time, and like many other detectives, I was stationed in the incident room at Keyworth, which is where all the information pertinent to that inquiry was filtered through.
Within hours, the police officers made an intriguing discovery.
Police officers came across a car which they believe they recognised as one that had been reported stolen the previous day.
Detectives were soon able to confirm the car, a red Ford Fiesta, was the vehicle that had been reported missing.
Obviously, alarm bells start to ring, because we've had two strange incidents that happened. Colette being missing, stolen car found in the vicinity. We'd be failing our duty if we hadn't given a lot of thoughts to that car, even at the very early stage.
The car was stolen 5 miles away from Keyworth in an area called Home Pierpont.
Earlier on in that day, at about 4:30, a lady had gone to tend to her horses and she'd parked up her red Fiesta motor car, left the keys into it, and as she'd gone away from the vehicle was stolen, and she thought it was an opportunist who drove it away.
As the detectives learnt more about the theft, they became convinced the car was connected to Colette's murder.
At the scene where Colette was found, there were tyre tracks in and out of the field, and there was no mud on Colette's soles of her feet that would indicate that she'd probably been attacked in the vehicle that was suspected to have been involved in this offence and sadly deposited in the field, and the offender driven away.
The detectives painstakingly examined the car for any signs of a struggle and discovered both blood and semen stains. Within hours of the media reporting Colette's murder, police officers were inundated with information from potential witnesses.
Information came to the police attention that as she walked to her boyfriend's house, she saw a couple of groups of people, had brief conversations with them.
As far as the people were concerned, there was no suggestion that Colette was being followed or anything, and she just seemed a normal, cheerful self.
Eyewitness reports revealed that Colette was last seen on the junction of Nicker Lane and Platt Lane, walking towards Willow Brook as expected. But it was another local witness who provided the police with a chilling piece of information.
The man had been working in his garden. When he heard a scream, he also heard a car skidding. He went to his gate to have a look, but he couldn't see anything. Of course, he thought nothing more about it, but passed that information as soon as he was aware there'd been the incident.
This latest piece of information suggested Colette had been taken just moments after the last sighting. As the investigation progressed, Colette's family struggled to cope with the traumatic circumstances surrounding her brutal murder.
You've got the initial shock of, all your worst fears have been confirmed. And then you suddenly realise, this is for real. It's not a dream. She's never going to come home. Knowing that she'd actually been raped and murdered. She was murdered for sex, if you like, for want of a better word. And I find that very, very difficult to come to terms with.
And when Colette's friends heard the news, they were devastated.
My friend Suzanne told me that Colette had been murdered. I didn't quite believe it at the time. And she said, Nick's got the paper.
Wendy looked at the evening newspaper and couldn't believe what she read.
It was there in black and white that she'd been found murdered. But I just didn't want to talk. All I did was cry. It was a total shock.
As details of the vicious murder continued to spread, not one, but two crucial witnesses came forward.
Two young girls who came forward, who separately had actually seen the man and been disturbed by his behaviour at that time.
The first girl was just walking from house to house in Keyworth during that early evening prior to Colette being abducted, and was definitely followed by the man in the red Fiesta.
She didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to her, but his behaviour, the way he was looking at her, alarmed her, and she immediately went to a friend's house nearby to get away from him.
At 7:30 p.m, the man approached the second girl, who was 14 years old.
She was exercising a dog, and I actually saw him, and he stopped nearby. When she looked at him, he asked for the direction of a nearby road.
The girl kept on walking, but was surprised when the same car pulled up next to her about 10 minutes later. The man got out of the car and walked towards her. The man seemed surprised by the girl's dog, Suddenly, he turned on his heels and left.
Once the two girls came forward, they were interviewed at great length and they were able to give us a good description of the man, which was vital to subsequent inquiries.
By questioning the two girls in detail, the detectives were able to build a picture of what Colette's murderer looked like.
The composite description was of a white male about 5'10", stocky build, with wavy hair. Without a shadow of a doubt, those two teenage girls were extremely lucky not to have been abducted and subjected to the assault that Colette was subjected to.
These two new witnesses were very important, but there was more to come. Detectives were about to speak to the investigation's most important eyewitness, whose testimony was to prove vital.
The landlady explained to the detectives that she'd seen this stranger in the pub with what appeared to be blood on his hands.
On the evening of Sunday the 30th of October 1983, 16-year-old Colette Aram disappeared as she walked to her boyfriend's house. Colette's body was discovered the next morning, abandoned in a nearby field. A post-mortem revealed she had endured a serious sexual assault before being strangled. The police appealed for information through newspapers and television, generating a wealth of leads. The information provided by one eyewitness who came forward was to prove crucial.
The landlady from the Generous Britain public house at Costock told the police that a stranger had visited the pub on Sunday the 30th of October between about 8:50 and 9:15 p.m.
The man explained he was in the area to visit a friend but had lost his way. Then the landlady noticed something unusual.
During the conversation, she noticed he'd got some blood on his hands, and she commented to him. He appeared generally surprised. He then went through to the gents' toilet, to where he washed it off and used the paper towels that were in there.
Despite her never having served a customer with blood on his hands before, the landlady had no specific reason to be suspicious.
But it's only when the following day, that she heard about the murder of Colette and immediately telephoned to the police.
Police officers headed straight over to the pub.
They searched through the gents' toilets and they took possession of the paper towels from there, including one where, to their eye, appeared to have blood on it.
Forensic scientists were able to prove the paper towel did have blood on it, but techniques available in 1983 could barely identify what blood type it was, let alone reveal whose body it had come from.
It didn't particularly take the inquiry further because we didn't know whose blood it was at that time.
The investigation continued, but on the 17th of November 1983, the detectives were surprised to receive a very peculiar letter.
The letter was written with a straight edge, obviously to disguise the handwriting, and an exclamation mark had been put in place instead of the S. Why is still not known to this day.
The letter goaded the detectives over their inability to catch him.
There was certain information in there that was not in the public domain, hence the detectives at the time believed the letter was genuine and that the perpetrator had actually written the letter.
The author of the letter betrayed his identity with a foolish mistake. Forensic experts found a fingerprint just above the line, "You will never get me."
It's significant that fingerprints were left on the letter, but I think it was an accidental mark. The letter was examined and checked on the databases that existed in those days, but sadly no hits.
The days turned to weeks, the weeks turned to months. Hard work was continued. We were running a full incident room and taking a lot of manpower because it was felt that it was an important case, one that we needed to throw whatever resource we'd got at it.
But despite the evidence found in the early stages of the inquiry, detectives were unable to identify Colette Aram's killer. And as time passed, newer crimes began to demand their attention.
We didn't actually close it down altogether at that time, but it was reduced after about 12 months to 18 months because we were getting nothing new on this particular inquiry to justify us carrying on.
There were no more leads.
They never actually knocked on the door and said, you know, we have to shelve this, we can't continue with the investigation. I just thought that they weren't doing anything about it anymore.
Colette's mother was devastated.
I'm thinking, well, you know, he's got away with this and he was out there living his life wherever he was and it wasn't bothering him and he didn't have any form of conscience, really. You know, all these things go through your mind and eventually this was one of the reasons I went to live abroad.
But in the late 1980s, detective work was revolutionised by the introduction of DNA profiling. Each one of us has a unique DNA profile. The police began to use forensic science to identify perpetrators of crimes by analysing any bodily fluids, skin or hair left at the scene of a crime.
If you could prepare a DNA profile from something deposited by the offender, you could then challenge the National DNA Database and potentially identify somebody.
And in 1997, Dr. Tim Clayton was given the task of using DNA analysis to identify Colette Aram's elusive killer.
My remit was to try and prepare a DNA profile from anything that may relate to the offender for which we could then search against the national database. And I was fairly optimistic that we would be able to at least attempt DNA profiling. We still had some of Colette's clothing and some various other items like the car mats and various swabbings taken from the vehicle. There were also some of the post-mortem samples available as well.
But there was a risk. Dr. Clayton was well aware that his investigations could have repercussions.
You've got a limited amount of material available, and the question is, do you commit it to testing now and effectively consume it and destroy it, or do you leave it and think there may be future developments which will give me better tests and better opportunities? And that was the dilemma that I faced in 1997.
Dr. Clayton decided to do everything he could to identify the DNA profile of the killer.
It's no good having it all in the freezer if it remains undetected. You know, I'd rather do it and fail than not advance a case.
Using samples taken from the post-mortem, the scientist was able to identify Colette's DNA profile. But unfortunately, he had less success when trying to identify the profile of her killer.
Most of the exhibits that we tested, a lot of recovered hairs and things, just failed to yield a profile because there was simply insufficient DNA present.
Dr. Clayton hoped to have more luck with a set of sealed microscope slides containing semen samples recovered during the post-mortem.
Those microscope slides had been kept, so I'd got there a little time capsule, a little sample of sperm from Colette's body, which had been sealed, and so they were obviously a target for us.
The forensic scientist got to work.
As it turned out, we didn't get the result we wanted. We got a partial result, not a full result.
A full DNA profile features 20 markers, 10 that come directly from each parent. Dr. Clayton had found just 3.
In the event, it didn't help progress the inquiry much other than provide the partial profile and maybe eliminate some persons of interest from the investigation.
Even the paper towel recovered from the Generous Britain pub failed to produce any fresh clues.
In 1997, the main object was to try and identify a potential offender. I'd failed in that regard, and eventually the 97 review was wound down.
But the murder of Colette Aram would continue to haunt the residents of Nottingham. And Nottinghamshire police remained resolute in their determination to catch the 16-year-old's killer.
When this crime happened, it rocked Nottinghamshire, and Keyworth itself has never been the same since.
In 2004, the case was to get a new lease of life when Detective Superintendent Kevin Flint was appointed head of Nottinghamshire Police's homicide unit.
Every person that's been involved in this investigation has wanted to bring it to a close. So I was as determined as anyone else that had worked on it to try and bring it to a successful conclusion.
Believing that new advances in DNA analysis could help identify Colette's killer, Detective Superintendent Flint launched a fresh investigation into her murder.
We ran the investigation as though it was a murder that had occurred today, with a dedicated inquiry team. This case was so big and there was so much information that had been gleaned. If that answer was there to be found, we'd find it.
Over the next 2 years, the team painstakingly analysed every last detail of the case.
There was in excess of 2,500 statements, 5,000 documents, up to nearly 700 exhibits. Everything was placed on the home's computerised system so that we could examine and identify any new leads in the inquiry.
Dr. Tim Clayton was also employed to re-examine all forensic evidence pertinent to the investigation.
I have to say I was quite pessimistic because in 1997 I'd thought I'd used everything that was left. We gradually built up a picture of what exhibits were left and came up with a batting plan of what to test. Now, one of the key exhibits was the paper towel, although I was still sceptical whether it was even linked to this particular matter.
Using improved DNA analysis methods developed during the 24 years since the police had first found the paper towel, the scientist was able to search for traces of blood and semen.
We picked up mixtures of DNA, effectively people's DNA profiles superimposed on each other. And when I looked at these, most of these mixtures appeared to be just two people, one male, one female.
Intrigued, Dr. Clayton compared the sample to the one full DNA profile he had recovered in 1997, that of Colette Aaron.
It matched, and here we are, potential link between Colette and a paper towel found in a pub toilet miles and miles away, and suddenly the landlady's story took on a better and higher significance because now we potentially got a positive link between Colette and this paper towel.
Suddenly, Dr. Clayton realised he was finally on the brink of discovering the full DNA profile of Colette Aaron's murderer.
It was possible to subtract Colette's profile from these mixtures. I was able to work out his DNA profile unambiguously, exactly.
In order to be sure all the evidence was pointing to the same man, the scientist ran the results against the partial profile identified back in 1997.
The partial DNA profile obtained from the microscope slide in 1997 was a match against this male.
24 years after the murder, Dr. Clayton had finally identified the full DNA profile of Colette's killer.
It was another significant boost and lift to the inquiry, and we knew that we were on the right lines.
Dr. Clayton immediately hoped he would find the killer's DNA profile already on the national database. He ran the search.
We got told almost immediately that there were no matches on the national DNA database. In the space of probably a few hours, we'd gone from being elated to being quite disappointed. I had on a piece of paper in front of me the DNA profile of Colette's killer, but it told me nothing about him. Without somebody to compare that to, it's effectively a useless piece of information.
Right, people.
The team were also disappointed by the news and wondered how someone who had committed such a horrendous crime could be absent from all police databases.
Throughout the investigation, the consideration was that the person could be dead, and obviously that brings with it the feeling that that person's got away with it, both from a police perspective and Colette's family. So it was still important to eliminate them or identify the person if he was dead.
Back in the lab, Dr. Tim Clayton was keen to utilise another form of DNA analysis known as familial searching.
First-degree relatives, that's parents or children or siblings along the same generation, have much more similar DNA profiles than do unrelated people.
By searching the DNA database for profiles with high similarities to the killer, it might be possible to identify one of his close relatives.
The search for the parent-child list yielded several thousand people, and the sibling list, again, gave several thousand people. So, although you've reduced the pool, no longer we're looking for now a needle in a haystack, we're now looking for a needle in a hay bale.
The scientist identified 3 groups of 100 people who had the closest DNA match to the killer. The first group were the parent-child matches. The next 100 were the sibling matches. And the final list featured persons of interest already named within the inquiry.
There weren't the resources to go down those lists further than that. It took nearly 18 months of work to screen out 300 people.
In 2008, as the 25th anniversary of Colette's brutal murder approached, Detective Superintendent Flint launched a fresh appeal for information.
We published a leaflet and delivered it to up to 20,000 homes in and around Nottinghamshire.
It was the first time that we'd publicised the fact we'd got a full profile, and we wanted it to be known that we were able to identify the killer.
The campaign generated hundreds of new leads.
There were lots of positive enquiries and lots of good information and lots of good potential persons of interest.
Despite a positive response, the detectives were still unable to identify Colette's killer.
We thought that a 25-year push would give us something. With the number of calls that we investigated, we were obviously very disappointed. You think, where do we go next with this? Is there any more? The key line of inquiry remained with the familial DNA.
However, in spring 2009, 18 months after first running a familial search of the killer's DNA, the team concluded their investigations of the 300 people identified.
As it turned out, none of the people on the prioritised lists had the same profile, and effectively all the top 300 people had all been eliminated.
The reinvestigation into Colette's murder was starting to look as if it had hit another brick wall.
Mr. Flint said, I think we're at the end now. We've given this a really good go. Is there anything else we can do now before we put this to bed and say we've tried and we failed? And I just came up with one idea. I just said, well, it was nearly 18 months, 2 years ago since we did the familial search. Maybe we should just redo it and just see if in the intervening period whether anybody has been added to the national database.
Detective Superintendent Flint gave the go-ahead and the forensic scientist ran the search.
To my amazement, on the top of the list came a person who had the highest ranked genetic likelihood ratio, and more intriguingly than that, that person lived very close to the Keyworth area.
The database had identified a man who had been arrested in early 2008 for a minor offence. Had detectives finally found 16-year-old Colette Aram's killer? "25 years after Colette Aram's blood-soaked body was found on farmland in Nottinghamshire, detectives were finally close to identifying her killer. Using familial DNA analysis, forensic scientist Tim Clayton had identified a 20-year-old man who shared a number of DNA markers identical to Colette's killer. But there was a major problem. He wasn't born until after Colette was killed.
We researched that individual who was actually on the DNA database, and quite clearly that was not the offender. Was too young and was not a positive match.
But the results suggested that either this man's father or possibly an uncle had raped and murdered Colette back in 1983.
Those inquiries led us to be interested in 4 brothers that emanated from South Nottinghamshire.
You can see the similarities.
Any of those individuals could have been the offender.
The detectives started to investigate the lives of the 4 brothers and were surprised to discover they had been raised in the Home Pierpont area.
We found out that the family home overlooked the site where the car was stolen from near the riding stables.
The family also had connections to Keyworth. We felt we were into the right family to find the offender.
Specifically, the detectives discovered that one of the men actually lived in Keyworth at the time of Colette's murder. His name was Paul Hutchinson.
Hutchinson married and moved to Keyworth with his wife in 1983.
It was quite surprising to find that he was a few streets away from Colette's address. There's no suggestion that he knew Colette or actually knew the family.
As the detectives continued to explore the lives of all four brothers, they became aware of a complication.
We found out that one of the siblings had died recently. So that was a blow initially, to think how we're going to eliminate this person.
Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing to Paul Hutchinson and the revelation that one of the brothers had passed away, the detectives couldn't rule anyone out.
We couldn't rate one higher than the other. Hence, we took the decision that all three surviving brothers would be arrested, and the only way to effectively eliminate was to obtain each individual's DNA.
On the morning of Monday, April the 7th, 2009, police officers carried out simultaneous raids on 3 properties in the Nottingham area and arrested 3 men on suspicion of murder.
2 out of the 3 brothers were cooperative and helpful and assisted the police. The other brother was uncooperative, and the officers felt that he was quite worried upon arrest.
Each of the men was taken into custody, where DNA samples and fingerprints were collected before being sent for immediate analysis. In the interviews that followed, one of the brothers, Paul Hutchinson, continued to be evasive.
One of the brothers had reserved his right to remain silent and effectively went no comment through all the interviews that were put to him.
With events developing rapidly, Detective Superintendent Flint telephoned Colette's mother, Jackie.
He said, "Where are you?" And I said, "I've just come in from shopping." And I said, "Why? Have you got something to tell me? Have you got some news for me?" And he said, "Well, we've got 3 brothers in custody, and we know that it's going to have to be one of them." And I just broke down. And then, of course, he said, "Well, we'll let you know more when we know more." And then he said, "I'll phone you in a couple of days."
As the suspects were interrogated, the forensic team closely examined the 3 brothers' DNA and fingerprints. Eventually, they were able to tell the detectives what they'd found.
One of the brothers' fingerprints was on the letter. And it was absolutely fantastic news, because there was always a question mark over whether the author of the letter was the killer, and this just confirmed it, and it was the icing on the cake.
And soon afterwards, the results of the DNA analysis were also confirmed.
I think around the 10 o'clock time at night on the initial day of arrest, I received a telephone call giving us the news that we got a positive match.
It was fantastic news, and it was what we'd been waiting for all these years, and it was the moment of truth, really. We'd found our man.
On Wednesday, the 9th of April 2009, 25 years after her death, the detectives were finally able to charge a suspect with the murder of Colette Aram. His name was Paul Hutchinson, and he claimed he was not guilty.
I think it was the mixed emotions, really, that I felt when he was charged. Relief, disbelief, all the emotions that I felt in the beginning raised their ugly head again.
As detectives started to collate evidence in preparation for the trial, it seemed that after Colette's murder, Hutchinson tried to live an almost normal life.
He'd remained local, living in Keyworth, and would appear to have been a likeable person to his immediate close family and close friends.
When the police team interviewed Paul Hutchinson's relatives, they were told Hutchinson's life hadn't been easy because he had fought intermittent battles with cancer. But detectives investigated all his medical records and found this was completely untrue.
He lied to his family about this and even went to the extent of removing some of his hair and disappearing for a little while, pretending to be in hospital.
Even back in 1983, during door-to-door inquiries immediately following the murder, Hutchinson claimed to have been in hospital receiving treatment.
His family were obviously unaware in relation to the fabrication about the cancer.
This man was an inveterate liar, made a career out of telling lies, particularly with his close members of his family.
Paul Hutchinson's murder trial was due to take place in spring 2010. But as the date approached, Hutchinson suddenly became cooperative.
Ultimately, we received the defence statement where Paul Hutchinson blamed his dead brother for committing this atrocious offence.
The tale he told was that his brother committed the offence and told him about it thereafter.
But unbeknown to Hutchinson, the detectives had already acquired a sample of his late brother's blood from the hospital in which he had been treated before he died.
We managed to obtain that individual's DNA, and with the cooperation of the deceased brother's family, we were able to eliminate him from the inquiry.
With his accusation of his dead brother discredited, the suspect had a sudden change of heart.
Thankfully, when he looked at the weight of evidence against him, he decided to change his plea to guilty and ultimately pleaded guilty to the murder of Colette.
In January 2010, Paul Hutchinson was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 16-year-old Colette Aram. Finally, Nottinghamshire police have been able to close one of their biggest cases.
The efforts of people some 25 years ago, supported by the efforts of recent times, have culminated in this man being found guilty. Had the original inquiry had the advancement of forensic technology that we had, hopefully this case would have been detected in 1983 or 1984.
Despite the many years which have passed, Colette's murder continues to affect everyone involved.
To this day, Paul Hutchinson has not explained why he's done what he's done, and that will be really difficult for the family to understand. I don't think we'll ever get an explanation from him.
And for Colette's family, her loss overrides any sense of justice.
I miss her smile. I miss her laughter. I just miss her. I just miss her very much. It's all those years ago, but it's like it was yesterday, and I just wish she was here with us now. And I think if she was here now, my life would be different too. But she's not, and she never will be.